Welcome to the last language learning video you'll ever have to watch. I'm not going to waste your time today. I know you're tired of these bullshit videos and apps promising you the secret method to learn a language in 24 hours. Since you're here, they probably didn't work for you because they sure as hell didn't work for me. I used to be the guy sitting in the back of Spanish class, almost falling asleep because I was so bored. I remember failing and thinking that languages just weren't my thing. Now, fast forward a few years later, and I speak four on my own. I'm not gonna lie to you, this will be a long video. What I can say is that if you watch it all the way through, I promise that you'll know everything you'd ever need to know to learn any language you want in the best way possible, potentially saving you hundreds of hours of wasted effort. We'll talk about why some people get fluent and others don't, how to learn everything from grammar to speaking in the best way possible, how to put it all together into a personalized study plan that guarantees you results, and much more. If you're tired of all the bullshit, conflicting advice out there, and you just want one detailed, straight to the point guide covering all the most important information you'd ever need to know, then you're in the right place. Welcome. But first of all, you might be asking yourself, why the hell should you listen to me in the first place? And that's a fair question, honestly. So let's talk about it. So why should you listen to me? Well, I don't have a PhD or some fancy degree. I don't speak 55 languages fluently, and I don't have a 400 IQ. I'm really just some guy who wanted to learn languages. I did what you're supposed to do, tried my best, but I didn't really get the results that I wanted. So I had to find my own way. And in the past 4 years, I've been obsessed with languages, learning multiple on my own, and also making a shit ton of mistakes. So during that journey, I've learned a lot, and I've come up with some systems and methods that I think make language learning way easier, that I'd like to share with you today. So let me start off by speaking in them a little bit, prove that I'm not completely full of shit. Maybe just partly. För det första är engelska inte mitt modersmål. Jag är från Sverige och även om de flesta här pratar engelska så har jag ändå lärt mig ett och annat att lära mig engelska till en rätt hög nivå själv. También he aprendido español. Empecé con un año de estudios en la escuela cuando tenía como 2 años, algo así. Y lo dejé porque era súper aburrido, la verdad. Y creo que saqué una F o una E, no sé exactamente, pero me acuerdo que pensaba que simplemente no podía aprenderlo. Y después me di cuenta de que no era yo, realmente no era yo, era el método. Porque unos años más tarde volví a empezar por mi cuenta y llegué a un nivel bastante conversacional. O sea, podía hablar, por fin, y no podía en la escuela. Entonces, ahora puedo hablar con españoles, puedo entender contenido en español, puedo hacer lo que quiero en el idioma, y sí, estoy contento. その後で日本語も独学してた。正直、スペイン語に比べると、最初はすごい大変だった。でも今、少しずつ、上達してて、今ネイティブと話せるネイティブのコンテンツもわかる。3年間勉強してるし、レベルは多分 N3、N2 ぐらいと思う。もちろん完璧じゃないんだけど、今結構満足してる。Ho imparato anche l'italiano, cioè un po' di italiano, perché veramente non posso dire che parlo italiano adesso. L'ho studiato per un mese, prima di mi viaggio a Italia, quest'anno, però dopo non ho studiato molto, quindi realmente non lo parlo. And that's it. Those are the 4.5 languages, I guess, that I speak. And now it's time to get into the meat and potatoes of this video and really show you how I got from 1/2 to 4.5 languages in just a few years and how you can do the same. Starting with why some people get fluent and others don't. Section 1. Why some people get fluent and others don't. This thing honestly screwed me for a very long time. I call it the action trap. And it's very prevalent. Almost every single person who tries to learn a language falls into this trap. Some people do the reverse, but oftentimes they fall into this. And it's because people love action. It's tangible. You just work hard, you get rich. Train hard, get jacked. You know, talk to someone, approach someone, get a boyfriend, get a girlfriend. Feels so good, right? You're like, okay, this is the only thing I have to do, and then I get my dream outcome. Well, the problem is that it's not always that simple, and showing up is not always enough. Because there's millions of people studying hard in school that barely can introduce themselves after years. I mean, we've probably been doing that ourselves, right? I know that I went to school, I tried learning, like I said, and it didn't really work that well. I mean, we show up, right? We try. Sometimes maybe not in the best way possible, but we try. We don't really get the results. But then, there's probably some fat guy in his mom's basement somewhere who learns fluent Chinese in like less than half the time. Or learning fluent Japanese to impress his, his anime waifu pillow. And he just succeeds. I mean, there are people like that out there. So now the question is, what's the difference? What do they do that the people who fail don't? Well, the thing is that they both take action, just different actions. And that's important because many times you'll be told to just take action, bro, just do it, just get to learning, don't watch these silly videos where they give advice on how to learn languages because you're not actually learning languages, blah, blah, blah. It's like, yeah, partly true, it can be true for the right person, but then for the wrong person, it's like, you just do some shit and you're like, yeah, I'm learning, but you're not really. And I made this mistake myself. First thing I thought was, I'm gonna learn Spanish. This was after, like I said, I was studying Spanish a little bit in school, then I quit it, and for multiple years didn't touch it at all. Then one day, actually on Valentine's Day, I was home, alone, depressed, miserable. Actually not. I think I was in a pretty good mood. I can't remember exactly, but it was Valentine's Day 2022. And yeah, 2022. And I had come home from a workout or something, and I was like, you know what? Let me learn Spanish for real now. And so I did the most popular thing, which was download Duolingo. And my method for the coming few days or so became just studying for 5 minutes here and there, reciting some sentences out loud because that's what you're supposed to do, right? It said, I think, in the loading screen of Duolingo, like, pro tip, say your sentences out loud afterwards. So I did that. And, I learned a few things. I learned a word for suitcase. I learned a word for watch. I learned a word for maybe like husband and wife and like something else, maybe like small or just like random adjectives and shit. And I was like, okay, all right, I'm making progress. Like I'm basically Spanish at this point. But, it didn't really materialize into some legitimate fluency or results. And so a little bit later, a few days later or a few weeks later, something like that, I did some research. And I found, shocking revelation, okay, that there's actually other, less popular, but better apps. And also, crazy, that apps aren't everything. I legitimately did not even know that there were methods out there. I mean, I knew that, like, okay, you can go to school, you can go to a class to, like, kind of learn languages, but, like, it doesn't really work. And, like, I knew that I myself had learned English, but, like, for some reason, I didn't really think of me learning English as, like, learning a language. It was just, like, a part of my life, But then when I look back at it, I was like, okay, well, I mean, I actually watched YouTube to learn a lot. So I realized that, like, you can learn languages by watching YouTube, and also realized that there were whole methods out there. That might sound a little silly, because it's very obvious to us now, right? If you're watching this video, you're probably a little bit more advanced, like at least there's methods out there, or you might be already speaking like 5 languages and you just want to watch this because you like me, and fair enough. Or you just want to learn more. But, I truly believe that the reason that most people make no progress is not because they aren't learning enough or don't have some secret polyglot talent, the one polyglot gene, but because that 90% of people don't even know what methods work, let alone exist, right? And so, I mean, if you're watching this, you probably already know about some methods and whatnot, but it's like there might be a thing that if you do it, you get results twice as fast. You just don't know about it. So that's why it's important to do some learning beforehand, right? And so don't spend years planning and never starting. But also don't be the guy who goes outside and proposes to the first girl he sees just because, just take action, bro, just do something. Because that might lead to some pretty bad consequences. And so, what's the fix? Well, the fix is what I call meta learning. So here we have this very handsome gentleman, um, Abraham Lincoln, and this quote is, "Give me 6 hours to chop down a tree, and I will spend the first 4 sharpening the axe." Probably heard it before, but I think it fits in very well here. And the difference between wasting your time for years, being one of those people in school who just like study but really get nowhere, versus um, being that guy, that anime pillow guy who just like locks in and learns Chinese in a year, is or could be just a few hours of learning to find out what actually works. And that's what you're doing right now. So I mean, good choice, good on you. You're gonna succeed probably if you do the right stuff. But just learning how to learn. Most people never do this. Asking questions like, are textbooks actually the best for this goal? Should I be using this app? Etc. etc. Doing this will get you aware of what works. It will help you avoid wasting time on what doesn't. And it gives you a plan of what to do to learn in the most effective way. Super important. And I think that genuinely, just watching this video, right? Imagine if you never watch any video like this. It doesn't even have to be this one, you know? Thanks for watching this one, but it doesn't even have to be like just something that gives you legit information where you prepare yourself and you give yourself sort of a roadmap to go off of. I mean, that's so helpful, right? It's like if you've never driven on any roads in one country, right, or in a city, and you have no map or nothing, like how the hell do you get to that point? You just have to drive and just hope you get to the right spot, right? But if you have a map, it's so much easier. And so to know if a method or tool works, I've made a simple framework that you can use. And I call it the fluency equation. So every language learning routine needs to work on 4 things. And if even one is missing, you'll never be fluent. These 4 variables are word quantity, word quality, processing friction, and productive friction. These sound like gigabrain terms, but they're actually pretty simple. So if you ever tried learning a language but not gotten the best results, this is why. Let me explain what each one means individually. And by the way, of course, if you do all of these, but you just spend 1 minute a day for 1 week, yeah, you're not gonna learn. But like, if you equal the time, you spent 100 hours doing something, not gotten results, versus spend 100 hours doing something, it's the person who have all these 4 variables that will actually get the results. So the first variable is word quantity. The foundation of every language is words. So you need to have a reliable way to increase that quantity. I used to know this, but I made a very common mistake that you're probably making too. I tried learning every unknown word I saw. But the reality is that words like grasshopper or like vacuum cleaner, they're not as important as words like that and I don't know, hello, etc. Right? Which is like, it is pretty obvious, but we're all making this to some extent. And so instead of focusing on just the number of words, like I need to know a lot of words. What you want to focus on specifically here is the percentage of common words. The words you actually need, not just useless stuff. Which means that you can know 10,000 words, but if it's all like different chemical concoctions and stuff like that, then that might not be as useful as 100 just basic words. But there's another thing, which is that more words is not always the answer. So you need to find a way to reliably increase the amount of words you know, because there's this common stat which is like the 1,000 most common words make up 80% of a language. And that's true. But that also means that you need to know the most common words. And also, even if you know the most common words, just adding more words to that is not really going to do much unless you have word quality as well. As a word quality is what I mean by word quality is how well you know words. Basically, where and how to use them, like conjugation, like collocation, word order, nuance, idioms, and more. So going from the base word, how it's actually used. So conjugation, obviously, if you have a verb, you gotta know how that verb is conjugated, like to run, running, ran, etc. Collocation is how it's used together with different words. So, for example, the word run means to run around. If you know that, that's great. But if that's all you know, then you'll be confused whenever you hear run out of gas, or run into a friend, or run a business. It's the same word, but I determine word quality as like you not just knowing the base definition of a word, but you actually knowing how it's used in real life, right? This is the actual usage of the word. This is what's most important. And so the thing here, right, which is the whole point of the fluency equation, is that some methods and tools are going to be great at increasing one thing, and some are going to be great at increasing another thing. And so you need both. The third variable is processing friction. This is how hard listening and understanding is. It's basically like the lag you feel, like your brain's internet connection in a sense. And so the lower friction you have, the better it is. Basically, high friction is mishearing words, taking longer to understand what's said and translating in your head. Imagine every time you hear me say something, you have to like pause the video, think back like, oh, what did he say? Okay, he said this word and that word and blah, blah. And a lot of times as well, people, native speakers especially, like put together words a lot and like they cut down a bunch of syllables to make it easier to say. But that can be pretty confusing if you've never actually heard that, right? So if I'm not going to say, I am going to go to the store. I'll just say, I'm going to go to the store. I'm going to go to the store. Like, it's basically like you sound like a tiger. I'm going to go to the store. Which is going to be really confusing if you never heard that. That's why you got to work on lowering this. And so low friction would mean 100% comprehension. Basically just understanding words and meaning clearly. Everything is just smooth and automatic. You never have to translate. You never have to think about like, oh, what does that word mean and blah, blah. You never had this lag in your head. I used to have this lag in my head and it's annoying as hell. I'll just tell you that, it's annoying as hell. And so it's really important to try and lower that. The fourth variable is something that a lot of people have to some extent, and it is productive friction. Basically how easy or hard it is to speak and produce language. It is the barrier to getting your thoughts out into the world. So high friction would mean that you basically have a thought, you have something that you want to say, and even if you know the words kind of, they just won't come out. I think we've all had this, you know, and it also includes mispronouncing words. It also includes getting nervous and just like, not really knowing what to say. This can happen in our native language too in certain situations. I'll talk more about that later. But it happens a lot of times in our in the language that we're learning, in our target language. And so this is not always a question of like, oh, you just need to know the grammar better. A lot of times it's just like we can't really use what we know and what we want to use. So low friction means the opposite. It's that thoughts become words without much effort at all. You don't really need to second guess every rule, and your speech is just clear. Speech is just clear. I'm proving that my productive friction is high right now. No, but your speech is just clear. And this is ultimately where you want to get to, right? So why do these variables matter? Well, it matters because most methods and tools are made to fail you. Sounds very conspiratorial, you know, but it's true. I mean, maybe intentionally or not intentionally, but that's why you can try so hard but really get nothing out of it. And why some people get fluent and others get stuck. Apps like Duolingo, for example, or others, you know, there's plenty of them, but Duolingo is the main one, right? They touch all four to some extent, but this is way too little. Let's think about Duolingo for a second. You have these translation exercises where you see a sentence, you translate it. Okay, you know, you might sometimes see a sentence in your native language and then you have to translate it into the target language. Okay, that's a little bit of productive friction, right? You lower your productive friction a little bit by kind of merging things together and creating a sentence. Cool. And then there's one little short speaking exercise. It's usually just repeating something out loud. You know, and then you have one like pair these together and blah, blah. Just a bunch of stuff jumbled together. But like, you don't really put any meaningful effort into either one of these, right? It's never like you sit down and just like listen to something for a long time, or you just like speak, and it's just a mix of things. And then there's methods like immersion methods, input methods, that are like, yeah, you know, apps, they don't work. And so we gotta do something else. And so they think, you know, listening is pretty important. That's actually what you do. You don't just sit and translate stuff. Cool. Let's prioritize listening. Well, the problem with that is that it only really builds 2 and 3, at least most effectively. It lowers your processing friction a shit ton, which is great. You can now understand and process stuff well. Cool. And it also helps you with word quality because you hear context in real time, right? Or like you get a lot of context from just hearing stuff in real time, hearing stuff used in real life. So if you don't just hear the word, or you don't just see the word to run in a textbook, like textbook definition, you also hear people use it in different situations and using different idioms and slang, blah, blah. Cool. But it's really bad at 1 and 4 because you're not really increasing your word quantity a lot, and you don't speak. And so then there's like the just speak, the just speak bro method, which fixes number 4, but this lacks the others. And textbooks and school and stuff like that, they usually build 1 and 2 well, but not the rest. You see the pattern? Almost no method works on all 4 variables. And when I understood that, I was like, oh shit, now it makes sense why so few people get fluent. But you're smart because you're watching this video, so let's learn to do this the smart way instead of the stupid way. That's always better. So now we know what we need. And so let's talk a little bit about what we can do to work on these in the best way possible, avoiding common mistakes. We need a mix of things that help us work on all 4 variables. Because if we just work on 1 or 2, we're going to lack the others and we're not going to be fluent. You're not fluent by just understanding and knowing a bunch of words. You also need to speak. You're not fluent by just speaking and not understanding. You need to understand too. And so we need a mix. That's why section 2 will be about learning activities. First of all, what activities are there to learn? Every single thing you can do to learn a language fits into one of 3 buckets, and we need all 3. The first bucket is studying. Here are your textbooks, your apps, your teacher instruction, grammar tables, word lists, etc., etc. Basically, whenever you sit down, you can stand too, you focus, you think, and you really dedicate yourself to learning something specific. Oftentimes, but not always, this involves translation and some conscious effort. There's input, which is listening, reading, watching, or a mix of all 3 somehow. Seeing the language in its natural form. You can be reading a short text, you can be listening to a podcast, you can be watching a TV show. These are all forms of input. And then there's output. Basically just speaking and writing. That's pretty much it. It's you producing or outputting, same thing, language in some way, either by yourself or not. Me talking to myself right now, I'm technically not talking to any direct person, but I'm outputting. But I can also be speaking to someone directly. And so there's a bunch of options in each bucket, like you can do different activities for input and output, etc., etc. But fundamentally, everything belongs into one of these buckets. So now the question is, how do we use each one in the best way possible to ultimately get fluent? That's what we all want, right? Studying. So there are 2 types of learners. Those who love studying and think it's the holy grail, and those who hate it. Both make some good points, so why do we want to study to learn a language? I know you've seen them. There's like these people who have like these cute routines with like 500 textbooks and color-coded notes and like, yeah, I'm gonna study. And then there's other people who are like, screw studying, just listen, just do this. And they both make some good points, but fundamentally I think they're both wrong, and I'm the only one who's correct, as usual. And so, I'm just kidding, by the way. The acceleration principle. This is the reason why I think we need to study, or not need to, but benefit from studying to learn a language. Think of it like learning how to fight. Do you spend all your time watching I know you're all fighters out there, right? Do you spend all your time watching YouTube tutorials and shadowboxing? Probably not, right? But you wake up one day, walk into your local boxing gym, punch the coach in the face, like, boom, say, let's go. Also, no, probably. Or hopefully, right? They'll be pretty dangerous and pretty stupid. And so the first one gets you good at isolated drills. Gets you good at the theory and the why behind things. The other gets you fighting right away. Yeah, but it also gets you knocked out like 100 times before you even learn anything. And so, we might want a mix of both, right? Seems sensible. Theory plus isolated drilling is, theory and isolated drilling from the studying, plus real practice from speaking and listening and all that, means fastest progress. Studying basically is or should be used as a tool to boost the speed of your learning. You don't fully learn something. It's like if you're boxing, you don't fully learn something. Just like, okay, jab like this, and that's it. Like, no, you need to actually use it in a real fight or like a real practicing kind of scenario to know how it's fully applied, right? But you learn the basics from just drilling it. That's the best way. And so, what do you study? The two main things are vocabulary and grammar. The main obstacle to fluency is the amount of words you know. So, we need to expand that number. To do that as effectively as possible, you need to first understand the 4 core principles of vocabulary learning. The frequency principle, also known as Zipf's law. It says that the most common 1,000 words roughly make up 80% of the language. And I believe it's also said that the most common 100 words make up like 50% of the language, 60%, something like that. Don't quote me on that, but roughly. Basically, it says that there's a few words that are used a lot, some that are used quite a lot, some that are used, a decent amount, some that are used very rarely, and then some that are like basically never used. And it kind of goes on there's sort of an order, right, where some words are used a lot more. And so, like we talked about in the word quantity portion, we don't really want to be focusing on learning words that we are learning just in case we need them. Like if we are in our first week of learning and someone uses the word for pepper or some shit like that, like, do we actually need it? Probably not. Like if we want to become a chef, cool. But otherwise, like, maybe let's wait a little bit. This is just to get the most bang for our buck, because we can only learn a limited amount of words, right? And the second principle is the repetition principle. Science has shown that you need to see a word around 10 to 12 times before it's fully learned, which means that just seeing it once is not really enough. You can't just see a word once, be like, all right, I got it, and then move on. We need repetition. And a lot of times, apps and textbooks don't really have this. They talk about a few words and, one topic, and they move on to the next. And then maybe they'll revisit it, maybe. But even that's like a big maybe. And if they do, it's like way later, so you basically forgotten it already. The third principle is the spacing principle. You can't just repeat a word 100 times in one day. And so you need to space out your learning. This is a total game changer. And it's one of the things that have been proven really, really strongly by science for a billion years now, basically. No, but I mean, if there's one principle, it's this one and another one I'll talk about soon, that are crucial, just absolutely mandatory. You can't be learning a word. You can't be the guy who hears a new word and you just repeat it to yourself out loud a billion times and you think that it's learned. It doesn't work that way. Your brain needs time to take in the information, to rest, to process it, to actually remember it, and to encode it into your long-term memory. And the fourth principle is the quality principle. The more attention you give a word, the more gains each rep gives you. Just a translation is something. You might be learning a little bit there, but it's not as good as if you're recalling it yourself. So if there's a word like apple in Swedish, that means äpple. If I see the word for apple and I'm like, ooh, what does that mean? Oh yeah, it means äpple. That's better than just seeing apple, äpple, because then I'm not really putting in the effort myself. And if I see additional info, like if I see a full sentence, like an example sentence, here's how you use this, even better. Especially if I had to recall it myself. Like, okay, how can I use this word apple in a real sentence? The more I do, the more layers we the more layers we add, the higher quality, quote unquote, each rep becomes. Oh yeah, I thought I was forgetting something for a second. And with quality, the recalling is super, super important as well. This is one thing that science has shown a billion times over is really important, and it's called a testing effect as well. Basically, just instead of seeing something, you need to be using your brain to remember it actively. So the big problem with word lists, for example, is that you just have a list of words and you just have the translations right next to them. It's not great at all. You need to be thinking about it yourself. Be like, okay, here I have a word, either in your native language or in the other languages. There's some nuance to that, what's best, what's not. It kind of depends on the scenario. I'll probably talk a little bit more about that later. But the most important thing is that you see a word in whatever language and you think about the meaning of that word. And you have to recall it yourself. And only after that, do you actually look at the answer. That is way more effective than trying to do it by just seeing the answer right away and then trying to remember it. And so the reality is that most methods lack these principles. Just like they lack the principles of the fluency equation, when it comes to learning vocabulary in itself, they lack pretty much all 4 of these principles. Word lists, like I just talked about, they lack quality and systematic spacing and repetition. So the quality, because there's no additional example sentences, because there's no recall, and also because there's no systematic spacing. Like you can, if you want to, just repeat the same word 100 times in a day and never come back to it. Or maybe you remember it and you're like, okay, let me go back to it tomorrow, but then you don't do it for 2 weeks. Like it's kind of all up to you. And so it's not really 100% clear on how often to repeat things. And repetition, like I said, it also lacks that because you don't know how many times to repeat. So you see translations once, maybe review them, or maybe don't. Apps and textbooks, they often lack all four to some degree. Speaking and listening to learn vocabulary, it works. I mean, you can learn by just speaking and kind of hearing things, but it's usually just way slower than adding in some studying, like we talked about with the acceleration principle, right? So what's the move? The solution in my mind is flashcard apps or spaced repetition systems, SRS. This is one tool that will handle all four principles for you, so you don't have to worry about if you're doing it optimally or not, basically. And look, it's maybe not the most fun. You know, let's be honest, we all just want to flex on people with our skills, we want to watch our favorite shows, we want to talk to people, make friends, etc., etc. Cool. That's why we're learning a language. But studying is important. And if we want to get to that point, we're going to have to know a shit ton of words. And we're going to have to know them well. So if we can use a method like this, that's maybe a little bit more boring sometimes, but we get way better results doing it, I think that's worth it. It handles the frequency for you because you choose which words to learn. So Anki works, I'll talk about that soon, but Anki works by you choosing to add words, or you can download decks that already have words put in there. But a lot of times you can basically choose to learn the most common words. So you're not at the mercy of some textbook putting in whatever word they think is important, you choose that. And they also have the repetition built in. So basically they have an algorithm that has a built-in review system. So it tells you to review a word whenever it knows that you're about to forget it. It also spaces out learning for you. It doesn't just tell you to review it a billion times in a day. It actually tells you like, hey, review this word today, review this again today because you haven't really fully gotten it. Then review tomorrow, maybe once or twice, and then you can review it, in 3 to 5 days, something like that. Then in a week, etc., etc. And it also handles the quality for you. Rather, you can use it to increase the quality as much as you want. If you have a word list, you can't really add that much to it. Like if you're just Googling definitions, what are you gonna do? Like, yeah, you can think of an example sentence yourself, but like it's not as smooth. Here, using Anki, you yourself can add the word, the definition, then you can add a sentence, then you can add some notes, like this word is different to that word because of these reasons and blah, blah, blah. And so whenever you open the program and you see a word, you yourself can think about it like, ooh, okay, this word is similar to that word, but like how is it different and blah, blah, and then you have it there. And my favorite program is Anki. It's the logo you see on screen. It's free on PC. I think it costs a little bit on iPhone or like iOS. Might be free on Android. I don't know. You have to look that up. But it's customizable and it actually works. So to me, it's a no-brainer. Even if it costs you like $20, you might not want to buy it right now. Fair enough, whatever. But I think that if you're serious about it, get it. And like I said, it's free on PC. That's where I used it. So I recommend it. All right, so how do you use Anki? Well, as a beginner, I would recommend to download a pre-made deck. There's usually pre-made decks for popular languages like Japanese, maybe Chinese, Spanish, etc., featuring the top 1,000 roughly most common words. If they exist, you can download them. They usually work pretty fine. Or in the description, I have a free tool for you that will generate you cards for any language at any level, for any topic, and also with additional information like example sentences, like English translations, like a little note with some extra beneficial information, basically. So if you want that, it's totally free. You can click on the first link in the description. You can get that. And I really recommend it because not all languages will have good pre-made decks, and it can take some time to make your own. I do recommend after a while to experiment with making your own. I'll talk more about that later. But in the beginning, I think that this tool is really good and it's really quick to use. You can just enter whatever level you're at roughly, and you can in less than a minute or so generate like 10, 50, 100 words and just import them straight into Anki. You also want to set realistic goals. learning 5 to 10 words a day, 5 to 15, 5 to 20, something like that, that's plenty. You don't even have to learn like 5 a day all the time, but like that's a solid kind of range to work within. Please, for the love of God, don't do some crazy shit like 100 words a day, 500 words a day. There are these videos and people who claim like, here's my system to to learn 300 words a day, and it's like, no, nobody's learning that many words a day. Like, it's just not possible, because after after 1 week, you're gonna have to be reviewing like 1,000 words a day or some shit. Like, it's just not feasible at all. And people who graduate high school, like native speakers around that age, like 18, 20, they know, I think, around 10,000 words, maybe 10 to 15,000 words. That's native speakers, right? Going to college, right? Or on the way to college. I believe at 30, you know, like 15,000 ish maybe, and then maybe go up to like 20,000. But trying to go for 100 words a day, I mean, you'll reach that level in like less than a year. That's just not realistic, right? Nobody's getting to a 30-year-old's level in 1 year. It's not gonna happen. So don't even worry about it. People who talk about that, they're just idiots, and they're honestly full of shit nine times out of 10. And so the goal isn't just to see as many words as possible and then move on. That's usually what they're doing. But it's also not to spend ages on every word. Instead, you want to make it enter your brain and to start the learning process. Basically, you want to add what's called or so-called a mental dictionary entry. This is a term I heard from a guy called Matt versus Japan multiple years ago. But I thought it's a really good term, honestly, and it in my opinion, highlights how most of your vocabulary learning should be looking like. Pretty much, you want to make it so that you get a basic definition of what the word means, you get a basic understanding of what it means, ideally through like an example sentence, and then whenever you're in a conversation or whenever you're watching something, you then learn the rest there. And there's a bunch of ways to learn vocabulary, but if you get these 4 basics down, you're honestly good. You can use Anki, you can use another method, you can use whatever app you want. Totally cool. I recommend Anki. I think it's really great, customizable, free, etc., etc. Fundamentally, whoever is successful at learning languages usually apply these 4 principles to some degree. So if you try to add more of them into vocabulary learning, you're guaranteed to see more success. But just throwing words out there won't really make you fluent either, and so you need something else, which is grammar. Once again, it's not the most fun thing in the world, let's be honest. But some study does help a lot. Even if grammar is boring, we should probably study it. The goal with grammar is not to recall it from memory. We want to know that big house sounds right and that house big doesn't, without having to think about it. We just want to make it automatic. Because if you have to listen to me and recall that every single time I say something, it's going to become really damn draining after a while. And so, on the other hand, a big misconception is that we have to drill every rule like 500 times to get fluent. And unlike what your high school Spanish teacher said, don't. Learning grammar is not only about drilling rules, and it's kind of about this Zen kind of detached style where you're letting stuff come to you and you're letting stuff go. Because a lot of times people try to force rules, they try to force grammar, and they think they're just like looking over a definition, just drilling it a few more times is really gonna get it. But the truth is that some grammar rules are just really dang hard to learn, and others are easier. And so some can be learned by reading it once or twice, and others take hundreds or thousands of hours to master. So even natives can get stuff wrong, like the your and you are conjugation. I see it all the time. Native speakers who've been living in a language for 20 years, 25, 30, 40, 50 years, and they get this wrong. And that's just the truth of life. There's a scientific term for this called the natural order. It's a hypothesis where basically stating that you can't force yourself to learn all grammar rules and that they come in a predictable order. So basically, some grammar rules just take longer and others shorter. And so that's why we want to focus on the basics. Focus on the most common grammar rules, the ones that are going to give you the most bang for your buck, and don't really worry about the ones that you might be having a harder time learning. You can always come back to them later. And a lot of times, if you just try to get a basic definition of one, like, okay, there's this one grammar rule that when you have, like recently I learned that in Japanese, when you talk about turning somewhere, or a while ago, I can't remember when, but like when you turn somewhere, you use a particle that, at least in my mind, didn't really make sense. I didn't really think about using that specific particle, but for some reason, you use it every time you turn somewhere. So you're like, at this place, insert particle, turn here. And that's one of those rules where it's like, okay, I could be drilling it, but like, how high ROI is it? How often do I talk about like turn left at this corner? you know, well, not that often. And even if I talk about it, I can still make myself understood without having this rule correct. So that's the important thing to realize. We don't have to have perfect grammar to just be intelligible and just use the language and understand stuff. But we do need to know the basics. And so the goal is to understand and be understood. So focus on the top 20% of rules that make up 80% of the language, just like the words we talked about before. So what you want to learn is stuff like word order. Basically, if you put the verb before the noun or after the noun, etc., etc. Verb conjugations, like we talked about before, which also has to do with word quality, right? So like conjugating run, running, ran, etc. You want to learn common rules, like how adding an S to a noun usually makes it a plural, because just learning this can unlock a bunch of words for you. If you know this simple rule, you can always think about it like, oh yeah, there was this rule, okay, cool. And then you can do stuff like 1 cup of coffee, 2 cups of coffee, etc. But on the other hand, some languages like Japanese, for example, have no plural. So you want to learn some language specifics as well. Spanish has genders for their nouns, and every single language has these specific things that if you learn them, you'll be able to pay attention to them whenever you're listening to something, whenever you're in a conversation, whatever, and pretty quickly, by just being aware of it, you will learn it. And you don't have to obsess over this. Like, I never obsessed over the fact that Japanese had no plural. Did I learn it like the first time I heard it? Did I remember it forever? Maybe not. I maybe got reminded of it. I don't know. It was so long ago. But the important thing here is just being aware of it and spending a little bit of time, like that meta learning thing we talked about before, spending a little bit of time becoming aware of these things to then save yourself a lot of time in the long run. And so what this does is that it gives you a map to operate from. We might take a wrong turn, and a part of the map could be wrong, but at least we have a guide. So we can still misuse grammar after having learned about it. That's totally fine. The goal here is not to be perfectionists and just like get every single little grammar thing correct. The goal is to, like we said, understand and be understood. And even if we learn a rule and we have actually gotten it backwards, that's fine. Because we're probably going to learn most rules pretty okay. And if we mess up on one or two, totally cool. At least we have a guide, right? A good analogy from economics that I really like is how cleaning a room to 90% clean usually means that you make the bed, you vacuum the floor, you put some things away. It takes like maybe 1 hour, and it's usually really high ROI with a very low time cost. But going from 90% to 99% clean will take experts, will take deep cleaning, and it could take maybe 10 hours for an additional 9%. And then going from 99% clean to 99.9% clean is like almost impossible. Not really, but like basically impossible, especially if you want to go from 99.9% to 99.99%, right? The more perfectionist you want to get, the harder it gets. And it basically will take you like microscopic precision and a year to get done or something. And so here's where you're gonna ask yourself, like, is it really worth sitting and worrying about every single grammar rule, especially after a while, when you're already able to be understood, etc., etc.? Probably not. And so that's why we want to focus on, like I said, the 20% of things that will give us the 80% of the benefit. So just learn what's necessary to lay the groundwork and let the rest come naturally when you see it in a video or maybe you use it in real life. And then the question is, how do we learn them? How to study grammar? So, unlike what some people will say, textbooks are actually not useless here. They're pretty good at explaining rules clearly, and they have some structure. Apps, they also work. My favorite app for grammar is an app called Language Transfer. It is only available or mostly available for like European languages. I believe it also has Swahili, it has Arabic, it has a couple others, but it's limited. But if your language is supported by it, like Spanish, French, Italian, German, etc., I highly recommend it. You gotta be aware with apps though, because some are not that good. With a textbook, it's usually more of an academic thing where the main purpose is education. It's like a guide like this, right? The point of this video is not to just like get as much watch time as possible or like to get as many clicks as possible. Like I'm not gonna clickbait you in this video because it's like hours long, right? The goal is just to teach you stuff, basically. And of course, I want to make it entertaining during the video, but the goal is to teach you stuff. And so the chance that a video like this is going to give you good information is a lot higher than if you were to be watching a YouTube short or like a TikTok video, right? Because it's so short and it can easily be sensationalist. And it's the same thing when it comes to apps. Some apps are truly really good, but others are like meh, right? Just trying to get your attention and some money or whatnot. When it comes to textbooks, I found that a lot of textbooks are okay, and some are extra good, but usually they're pretty similar. But on the other hand, apps can vary a lot, so just be aware of that. Language transfer is really good, but on the other hand, like Duolingo is completely different and not great, and then there's others that are probably worse. So the truth is that every resource works if it explains rules and you stick to it. That's it. You just need to stick to it, and it needs to explain the basics of the language in a way that you understand and that you like and that seems sensible to you. So just pick something that you like and go through it. YouTube videos and online courses or classes, like booking times with like an online tutor or even going to a physical place can work to just get the basics down. Because the goal with grammar study is not necessarily to master every single rule, it is to lay the groundwork so that we then can understand stuff when we watch YouTube videos or when we have a conversation. Like vocabulary, you don't just want to skim through these books and courses, but you also don't want to obsess about every single thing. Let it come to you. Be the Zen monk sitting in the woods somewhere on a mountain and just like, yes, I'm gonna take this rule, I'm gonna ignore this rule, blah blah, right? Great little visual for you there. And so, summary of studying and how you want to use studying to learn is that the purpose is to speed up your learning, not to teach you everything explicitly. It is hard to learn a word/rule 100% from studying. Usage will vary a lot. You just learn a word, it might be used in different ways, and you also want to know things automatically. And so that is why you want to use listening and speaking. But it's also slow to learn 100% from listening or speaking. Yes, it's more realistic, it's more hardcore technically, or maybe it's not, I don't know. But it's more realistic and it gives you more context, but it can be very slow. And so you kind of want to find the middle ground. And I'll talk about what the middle ground is exactly later. But the mistake that keeps a lot of learners stuck is just studying. If you ever heard or tried to say something, and despite knowing the words and grammar, you just can't. I've had it happen to me. Because when I started learning Spanish, I used apps and I studied a lot. Like I talked about before, I used Duolingo. Then I went on to language transfer. Then I used Anki. And I made great progress, don't get me wrong. I did learn a lot of stuff. But there were a few things missing. When I tried to listen and speak naturally, I had a really, really hard time because my brain was always lagging behind, even when I knew the words, which was curious. And after some time, I realized the problem. My mom, she speaks fluent Spanish. She's lived in Spain before. And so sometimes when I was learning Spanish, I'd ask her about a new word or a rule that I learned. And she was always like, can you give me an example? Or can you use that in a sentence? She never thought in absolutes or in translations. And this really surprised me because I learned words via translations, like this word means this thing in English or Spanish, or sorry, this thing in English or Swedish. And I was like, this rule means that when you use, or like means that to say this, you gotta translate it in this way and blah, blah. But she didn't really know these rules. Like she never learned that you conjugated things in a specific way to say a specific thing. She didn't think about like, oh yeah, this word actually means that, and this other word means that, and they're a little bit different. She didn't know any of this. But she still used them perfectly. And so I thought, how is that possible? Then I heard about input. I started watching videos to learn as a main activity. Because in the past, I watched a little bit of videos, but not a lot of them. And I didn't really see it as like a real thing. And in a few weeks after watching a lot of videos, everything changed. My brain stopped translating everything, and I could finally understand stuff and speak way easier. In the past, whenever I was watching a video, I remember I was having a really hard time keeping up with the video because even if they spoke slowly, even if I knew the words, etc., it was like every word popped up in my head along with its English translation and along with these grammar rules. And I was like, oh, like it was really, really hard to focus. And so whenever I tried to watch something that was a little bit quicker, super hard. And input is just basically listening to and reading things. The good thing about input is that it helps you get used to how language actually sounds. And that's why I see it sort of as the glue that holds everything together. Language is, like you might know, not just one word plus another, consciously combined with grammar rules. It is a whole thing with like, it is words, but it's usually expressed in a way that's just natural. You just take your thoughts and you say it in a way, right? I don't take my thoughts and be like, ooh, what word fits here? Like I want to say this in Swedish, so I take them to English and then I combine it with this grammar, blah, blah, blah. It just flows. And so while my mom couldn't explain the words and rules, she knew how they were used intuitively. And really, that's all you need to know. So unless you want to translate every word, sounding like a robot, being stuck in your head, you need input. Need. This is not optional. What is input? Well, most people know that listening and reading can help, but they don't really know how it works and how to use it. In the 70s/80s, there was a guy called Dr. Stephen Krashen. And he said that studying is just for teaching us rules. And input, listening and reading, what input is what causes acquisition. What he meant was the real fluency. And reality is that since then, we've kind of figured out that it's not that simple, but there is a lot of truth to it. And so the reality is that listening to or reading something that you mostly, but don't fully understand, that's the important thing, means your brain will have to use clues to fill in the other blanks. And over time, you notice patterns and see how words and grammar is used. And then you learn them that way, which is called comprehensible input. So a basic example of that is if you read a short text or you hear someone say something like, I was driving my bam to the store, and then I parked my bam and I went out. And then I jumped in my bam again and I drove home. That's probably a word that you've never heard, right? Yeah, I'm gonna assume. But obviously you can understand that bam means car. And so that is basically how you would learn things in this way. And the good thing with that is that instead of just seeing car equals bam, you see it in action, which makes it a lot more memorable because you're automatically associating it with other words that are commonly used together with it. And you're also not being tied to translations. So if the only way you learn a word in is bam equals car, then you're never going to be able to disassociate car from bam. Like every time you hear, it's a ridiculous word, but anyways, every time you hear bam in like a video or a conversation, or you want to say it, you're always going to be thinking about car in another language. And we don't really want to be doing that because the way that we learned our native languages was not via translations. We just heard things, we put things together, and via context, we understood what it meant. And so that process is necessary because not everything can be learned explicitly. So some word can be learned explicitly, but you're not going to get the full understanding, the full depth of it without seeing its context and seeing it used in real life. And also, when it comes to grammar rules, you're not fully going to be able to understand how they're used without hearing them be used or use them yourself. And so, to not be stuck in a textbook forever, we really need inputs. But then the question is, how do we use it? The first principle for using inputs effectively is difficulty. There are two main principles, and the first is difficulty. I can already hear some of you say, but won't it be hard to learn from watching movies and reading books? Yes, it is. For most movies and texts. That is why we need to have input that is comprehensible. That is, like I said, input that you mostly but don't fully understand. And it's really hard to find the exact range of exactly how comprehensible you want it to be, but somewhere around 80 to 98%, sort of depending on the exact content, whether it's reading or listening. I'll talk more about that later, etc., etc. But you want it to be to where you're seeing sentences and you're understanding the main gist of it. If it's any less than that, if you are on your first day of learning a language trying to watch the native news or some podcast about philosophy, you're gonna really struggle. The second principle is that input has to be interesting. No shit, right? And so this is not just because you will do more of what's interesting, but it actually is because science has shown that you will just learn more the less bored/stressed you are. So if we're both watching the same show in Chinese, none of us speak Chinese at all, right? We're at the exact same level. If I like that show more than you do, I'm gonna learn more than you. And other way around too, right? So you want stuff that's interesting. Plus the factor of you just wanting to watch more stuff that you find interesting, of course. But you're gonna make sure that your input has both. And so some examples of good input is beginner YouTube videos. If you're new to learning Spanish, you can go onto YouTube and search for beginner Spanish comprehensible input, and you will find a ton of videos. There's a channel called Dreaming Spanish that I actually started watching a lot back when I discovered the importance of input. They have a ton of these. They have videos like I talked about, like this is an eye, and etc. etc. And they have videos like here's a car, and this is a red car, and blah blah blah. And so even if you basically understand nothing, because the vocabulary is so limited, and because they speak so slowly, and because they have so many visuals, you're going to be understanding a lot of stuff. Especially if you combine that with some explicit studying, like you are going through a textbook on the side. You can also use simplified text. You can use basic podcasts. I'm going to be talking more about this later, but anything that's listening or reading that you find you can kind of understand the point and the main message behind the video, but also like behind each couple of sentences. You don't have to understand every single word, and you won't understand every single word. But if you understand the main gist, that's probably enough to be consistently picking things up. So that is kind of the basics of input. Input is listening or reading and to have it be effective, it needs to be specifically comprehensible input, at least let's say 80% comprehensible. And you find that via picking stuff that is easier. Pretty simple. There's a bunch of other tricks you can use to make input even easier, like for example, using visuals and stuff, but I'll get into that soon. Now, the more advanced you are, the more options you have. If you have been learning a language for 3 years, let's say, you can probably watch native content and use that as your input. But if you're in the beginning, you might not want to do that. That's what people can learn. That's what people can watch anime and stuff like that from day one and not really pick up a lot of stuff because the language is just way too difficult for them. And in the same way, if you're just watching boring beginner videos because they're easy, you can kind of lose motivation and also pick up way less language just because you're not really enjoying it. So you're kind of zoning out and just being like a zombie. Now, to really make your input more effective, there are some enhancements and some strategies that we want to use. The first question is reading versus listening. And to solve that, we want to think about what we truly want from input. Basically, what we want is to see words and grammar that we've already partially learned, like a word that we've seen in Anki once and we kind of understand, but we haven't truly mastered yet. We want to see that in a real sentence and in a real life scenario, so we can recognize it and be like, oh, there's that word, and now we know it a little bit better. And when we've done that, let's say 5 to 10 times, then we truly understand it. And so that's what we want from input. On top of that, we want to hear sounds of the language to get used to those. And we also want to learn new things, totally new words, totally new grammar rules. So those are the 3 main things, right? Reading does all of those, except the sound part. Listening does all of those, but it also gives us less time to focus on words and grammar, which means that it's probably a little bit worse for that. Listening is also more fun and usually easier to do on the go. Like you can, when I say on the go, I mean that you can listen to a podcast while you're walking somewhere, but you can also just easily put on a YouTube video when you're eating, for example, which you can't necessarily do in the same way with reading. I mean, you can have a burger in one hand and a book in the other, but it's kind of unusual, right? And so those are some individual benefits and downsides. Now, the main difference here is going to be that listening offers the sound benefit. That is a very big thing, because if all you do is reading, then first of all, you could read a bunch of stuff that you've never heard and mispronounce words, which gives you a bad accent. But it's also going to be hard to translate words that you've only seen in a book or seen in text into real speech, because they can be pronounced slightly differently, they can be said very quickly, etc., etc. And so that's the benefit of listening. But another very big difference is that it's going to be a little bit worse for vocab and grammar. So if you just purely want to learn new words and you want to have one way of doing input that maximizes that, I'd say reading is better. Another thing here is that you got to be cognizant of reading being quite difficult. And so if you're new to learning a language, reading is going to be out of the question for a while, because you need somewhere around the level of 95+% comprehension for reading. Because if there's 100 words on a page, imagine if you only know 80 of those. You're going to have to stop all of the time to look up new words. It's just not going to be feasible. And if you only know 50 of those, I mean, forget about it, right? Forget about it. And then, yeah, but for listening, there's going to be visuals, there's going to be other stuff, and so it's going to be a lot easier. The big reason for why reading is better for learning vocabulary and grammar is that it has no breaks. So imagine you're watching some horror movie and people are talking, they're at the breakfast table, they're like, hey dad, do you want to take me to school today? And he's like, yes son, I will take you to school today. And you're learning language there, right? But then later on, there's some like scary creep who breaks into the house and he's standing behind the door, and there's like a very long drawn out tense scene where he's like standing there with a knife, like, that's dope. That's great, right? That's what makes movies good. But especially those scenes. No, I'm just kidding. But that's awesome. But the problem is that they're not speaking in those moments, and so it's like usually videos are gonna have more of those than texts, because you can kind of read at your own pace. So if you're a quick reader, especially, then you're gonna be able to see words very quickly. And it also gives you more time to analyze, because you can kind of pause if there's a word you don't understand. You don't have to pause the actual video, but you have the text in front of you, so it's way easier to kind of look at the surrounding words, etc., etc. So reading is going to be a little bit better for vocab and grammar learning, but because it has no visuals, it's going to be harder. So because people are not pointing at things, you're going to have a harder time understanding them. If you don't understand a word, you just don't understand it. But in listening, if you don't understand a word, via them showing it, you can understand it. And so those things, combined with the fact that most people just like listening more, and you can do it anywhere, and it also trains sounds, I would say that it's simpler and more versatile. So if I had to give you an answer, I'd say mostly listening is usually going to be best, but you should do both. Mostly listening is best for most people because most people like it more, so they're going to be more consistent with it, and also because you're going to be lowering processing friction. If you only listen for 1 hour a month, then it's going to be really hard to kind of understand things in real time, because you just not spent enough time practicing that skill. On the other hand, most people prioritize, and I mean, it's true that if you don't spend a lot of time reading, especially for languages like Chinese, Japanese, Arabic, etc., with different scripts, you're gonna suck a lot at reading too. But most people prioritize speaking and listening, like being good at real conversations. So because of that, I'd say that prioritizing listening is probably the best idea, or is probably the better idea. Yes. Now on to the second strategy, which is multimodal learning. This is just a gigabrain way of saying using multiple things at once. And so just using audio is totally fine. Using audio plus video is going to be better because you are now having the visuals from the video helping you. And using audio plus video plus text is going to be best. So if you're watching a YouTube video and it is just me sitting right here speaking to you with no PowerPoint presentation, nothing, I'm not showing you anything, I'm just telling you about my day, sort of like the same thing that happens when you're reading something. If you don't understand the word, you don't understand it. That's it. But if I'm showing you something, it's going to be easier. And you're also, this is not just for comprehension, but it is for actual learning and retention as well. There's been a lot of studies and a lot of research done on this, and I've looked into the research, and it is consistent that using multiple ways of learning is always, pretty much always, going to be better than not doing it. That is just fact. So whenever you can learn things using multiple tools, it's just giving your brain more tools to, first of all, guess correctly, which then gives you the comprehension, etc. So you learn more that way, but also for just remembering straight up. And so whenever you're learning via listening, you want to ideally watch stuff that is more visual, like let's say a cooking show instead of just a story time. And ideally, if you can put on subtitles in that language, it's going to be even better. More tools for your brain just makes it more likely to guess right and to learn new things. That's why I think vlogs, cooking, drawings, etc., all of these things are very good things to have in your input. And this ties into subtitles. Should you use them or not? The answer is almost always yes. I believe that subtitles are like the multimedia thing. It is just another way for your brain to see things and guess correctly. If you didn't fully hear a word that someone said, you can see it in the subtitles, and you now got an extra word that you could potentially learn. And if you are listening and you're reading at the same time, you're just giving your brain twice as many inputs basically to process, which will almost always make it so that the things that you're hearing get stuck into your memory a little bit better. Now, the main argument that I've heard against subtitles is that it can lead to a couple of bad results. And the first one is that if you never have to listen hard, like you never have to sit down and really distinguish one word from another, and you can always just resort to reading the subtitles and seeing it that way, then whenever someone speaks quickly or speaks in a, let's say with a more difficult accent in real life to you, you're going to have a really hard time because you're used to these subtitles. They're sort of like a crutch. And the second way it can backfire is that if you use native subtitles, your brain will just resort to reading the easier language. This is why there are some people who've been watching anime for thousands of hours and they still don't speak more than like a handful of words of Japanese. They know like sugoi and onichan and like something more, and that's it. And so don't use native subtitles. It's as simple as that. Basically, never do it. There are some niche scenarios where you could do it. I believe I'll mention more about that later. I'll talk more about that later. But you pretty much never want to do that. And so the important thing with subtitles, I just want to say it real quick because it's really simple. Like, pretty much always use subtitles, but beware of the fact that if you always use subtitles and you never have to listen hard, then you could struggle when it comes to actually just listening, like a real conversation. And because of that, I think that if you're using podcasts as a part of your language learning routine, I believe that this is pretty much fixed straight up. Because, for example, for me, I watch a lot of YouTube videos and I watch a lot of Netflix shows, and I always use subtitles for those. But whenever I go to the gym, I pretty much always have a Spanish or Japanese podcast, depending on what I'm learning at the time. playing in my headphones, and there's obviously no subtitles on there. And so I get used to listening and distinguishing different sounds um, without subtitles regularly too. And so long as you have this kind of pure listening thing as a part of your routine in some way, I think you're good. Especially if you're also speaking frequently. Like if you're frequently having conversations with people, you're getting the exact training that you want right there. So yeah, I don't think this is as big of a problem as a lot of people make it out to be. And if you can learn words, let's say 20% quicker by using subtitles, like you instead of learning 10 words in an hour, you learn 12 words. It's, like you want to be doing that, right? For some potential downside of like not being able to distinguish every word and mishearing some things once in a while that we don't even know is true, and that you might fix by just doing some pure listening as well, I don't think giving up on this benefit, which is subtitles, is worth it. Another very important strategy is narrow input. And if you combine this with the two previous strategies of multimodal learning and subtitles, you will get some real gains. This is where stuff gets really good. And most people don't understand these strategies when it comes to input. But if you do, I mean, you're going to be learning at like twice the speed of someone else. Narrow input is a scientific term that pretty much just means lots of input on limited topics. A big mistake in general in language learning is trying to learn everything. Specifically when it comes to input, it's input about a trillion different topics. And when it comes to textbooks, it's them switching focus every other page. So a lot of people, when it comes to input, they think that the more the merrier. If they are watching a beginner channel, usually these channels will have like, here's my Christmas decorations, and there's like someone showing like, hello, Merry Christmas, this is my Christmas tree, blah blah. I don't know why I can think of that. It's Christmas right now, so that's probably why. But like they have these a bunch of different kind of things like, oh, here I'm going to dinner with my friends, and then it's like a vlog in like simplified language, and then it's like, oh, here are my favorite things, and here's me cooking, and here's me playing a sport, etc., etc. And if this is the way that you use input, that's fine. But when you keep switching topics like this, you're missing a very, very important thing. We've talked about it before. We've talked about how important it is when it comes to learning vocabulary, and it's repetition. And so narrow input fixes this. By focusing on one topic until you're good at it, you're going to get a shit ton more repetition than the guy who just keeps switching topics every single video and keeps having to learn a bunch of words for just one video, and then the next video they're not repeated in that whole video, and they might not even see them until a week later, and they've already forgotten it, they have to relearn it, and blah blah. How I used narrow input learning Japanese was that in my first 1 to 2 years, I basically just stuck to really basic topics. I watched content on food, on fashion, and on daily life. That's it. The reason for that is because they're simple, they're useful, they're visual, they're repetitive, and they're fun. It's people showing their new clothes, being like, here's my new black shirt. It's people talking about food, like, ooh, this onion looks really good. And that way, I obviously learn stuff easier because even if I don't know the word for onion, I'm going to learn it via the visuals and the kind of repetitive nature of it. And so what this did was that because I essentially only watched content on a few different topics, I got really good at understanding those topics. So I could watch native content even when maybe in general I wasn't at that level. And I could also actually understand it, and I could build relevant vocab in the topics that I wanted to get good at. My goal when I was learning Japanese was to get pretty decent at it before a trip to Japan. And in my trip to Japan, what did I want to do? Well, I wanted to like eat food and shop and like walk around and just like do regular kind of stuff. And so I needed to know some daily life vocabulary. I needed to know some fashion vocabulary, and I needed to know like some food vocabulary to read menus and stuff like that, right? And order stuff. And so these three topics basically covered everything I needed to know. And they also fed into each other because in a daily life reality show, they're going to be talking about food. And so when I'm watching food content, I'm learning more about that, and they feed into each other basically. And so the idea behind narrow input is that when you purposefully limit the words you can hear, you will increase the frequency of them, which equals way more learning. This is pretty simple math, right? If you can possibly hear 10,000 words, then that means that each word will have to be used less than if you can hear 5,000 words, or 3,000 words, or 2,000 words, which means way more learning because you're getting exposed to each word way more times. And so practically how you do this, how you apply this, is just picking 1 to 3 topics that you like and only consuming content about that. Once you understand one topic, you can add another, but this can take a while. Mind you, I was using these 3 topics pretty much exclusively for like the first 2 years of my Japanese learning journey. And I was studying like a decent amount, and I still didn't add new topics all the time. I stuck to the same ones for a long time. And over time, what this will lead to is that you know the general vocabulary, because obviously if someone is describing a plate of food, they're gonna say like this plate of food. And if you're describing a shirt, you're gonna be like this shirt. And so you're gonna learn common words like this, or good, or black, or happy, or whatever, right? And you're also gonna learn the grammar, because they contain a lot of the similar stuff. But what you'll also learn is specific vocab for your interests. So use narrow input. That's basically what I wanted to say. I'll talk more about that later, exactly how to do it in a plan and when you want to start doing it, etc., etc. But that's the basics. Active versus passive input is another topic. A lot of people think that input is passive, but that's not necessarily true. Active input would be things that involve you putting in some kind of effort. So it could be that you're just thinking about what you're learning. You're like, oh, that's a new word. He used it like that. Okay, cool. Now I understand it. It could be that you're just noticing new words. Like you learned a word in Anki and now you're seeing it in a video and you're like, oh, there's that word, like we talked about before. And it can also be that you're pausing when you're confused. So if there's too much and if there's a bunch of new words, you might want to pause. And so being active, or like you can make input more active by pausing and looking things up and stuff. And passive input is just basically watching like a zombie with no engagement. That's passive input, but like, do we even consider that learning? Like, I don't really agree with this argument that that input is necessarily passive, because it doesn't have to be. And so there's 2 things that you don't want to fall for. The don't look anything up kind of trap, because that's BS. A lot of people will think that the only way to use input is to just like let whatever you understand, or let yourself understand whatever you understand, and like not forcing anything and blah blah. Because for some reason looking things up will be bad and like, I don't know, be this deadly sin. But on the other hand, like you don't want to be looking up everything, because that's gonna take away from your flow and how much input you're consuming. So you want to find a middle ground. And the truth is, with learning in general, that the more effort you put in, the more you learn. To a certain point, right? So find a middle ground. And that's where I'd say that there's 2 types of input that you might want to be using: free flow immersion and intensive immersion. Free flow would be just chilling, following the content and understanding the main points. So what you're doing right now is technically free flow immersion for this video, right? Now, you understand English, so it's not really like an effective way to learn languages at this point, right? But still, like this would be the kind of activity you do, right? You're just watching something pretty much for enjoyment, or for just understanding what the person is saying in that video, right? Or in that text. Well, intensive immersion would be if you're like pausing and you're really analyzing each sentence and whatnot. And that's really good for potentially understanding how individual words are used a little bit more. So like, let's say you're watching something and you see a word that you kind of get, but you don't really get. Then you can pause and be like, okay, he placed it right there and he used it to describe this thing. Why would he not use this other word instead? And then you maybe look it up and you're like, okay, so the difference between this word and that word is this and blah, blah, blah. And that's being a little bit more intensive, right? You're using the input as a way to help you better understand individual pieces of the language, while free flow is just kind of tying it all together. And I think you should use both. If you're confused about input, it is a very heavy topic. I've been recording just this input summary now for 1.5 hours or some shit. So it is confusing. But the summary of how to use input is fairly simple. You want to mix listening and reading. So use TV, use books, use YouTube, podcast. It all works. Just make sure that you mostly understand it. You want to use visuals and subtitles whenever you can. And you want to stick to similar topic for periods of time. So sticking to the same YouTuber even can be a good idea instead of switching between a bunch of them. And sticking to the same niches of content is it's going to increase your comprehension and just make you learn a lot more. But the most important thing is just not to stress. Enjoy the content and watch stuff you like while just trying your best to understand. And if you do that, you're going to get a lot out of input, especially if you combine it with studying in the way that we talked about before. But understanding doesn't really matter if you can't speak. So let's move on to output. The big problem here is that we all know people who grew up hearing their family speak a language for hundreds, thousands, or maybe even tens of thousands of hours, but they can't really speak it themselves. This happens to language learners too. I mean, we've both probably had times where we want to say something, but we struggle a lot. Why is that? I call it the production gap. So there's a ratio that science has shown is roughly 20% between so-called receptive versus productive knowledge. Basically, just once again, gigabrain terms of that mean that we can only use around 20% of what we can understand. So let's imagine we're at a family dinner and you hear your uncles, your aunts, your grandparents speak, and you understand all of it. But when they ask you a question, your response is 5 times worse than theirs. That would probably feel pretty shitty, right? Justifiably so. And so, the reason for this gap existing is pretty much trying to use the language in super high stress situations. We all want to feel like we're good at things and like we belong. Of course we do. So when our speaking is connected to those two, what's going to happen? Well, our brain is going to freak out and it's going to use all of its resources to stress the F out instead of speaking. Naturally so. But let's say we're speaking to our best friend in our native language. Will that happen? Well, probably not, right? Because we're used to it. It's normal. We're good at the language and we know the friend and we know the situation and it's all good. And so the main issue between us not being able to translate our thoughts into real speech is going to be the pressure that we put on ourselves and the pressure that situation brings upon us. We see it as this big, final, scary boss, so we freak out. And that's why the goal of output is to systematically and slowly get used to creating and recalling language in a way that minimizes stress and bad emotions. I'm going to say that again. The goal of output is to systematically and slowly get used to creating and recalling language in a way that minimizes stress and bad emotions. The block happens from us feeling stressed out, not used to it, and like we have to perform. So we gotta minimize that systematically. It's not something that happens overnight. We can't just tell ourselves like, oh, it's all good, we can mess up, that's fine. No, like we have to actually do something about it. And it's a process. The reality is that the language is already in our heads. Of course it is. We understand it, right? If we can understand something at one level, like you can understand a YouTube video of someone speaking, then it's in your head, like you understand the language. You just need to train yourself to be able to produce it. And we basically need to shift this ratio from 20% up a little bit so we can produce more of what we actually know. And so now the question is, how do we activate the knowledge and the language that's in our heads and turn it into output? First of all, we need a little definition of what output even is. And I count it as anything that has you combining words into sentences. That includes, but is not limited to, speaking with yourself, speaking with a friend, journaling, and even thinking. I put a little somewhat in parentheses there because oftentimes when we hear output, we think about stuff that goes out of our mouths or is written down on paper, writing or speaking with someone. But when we actually think about what output consists of or what we want from output, the main thing we want is to go from passively absorbing language to actively creating and producing language. And even thinking could count as that, because we are taking words that we know and putting them together into sentences. And that's important because I created something called the output difficulty ladder. And each activity here goes in order of which is least stressful to most stressful. And most people will only use the top ones here. So no shit, they're stressed out when they try to speak. What you want to be doing is instead using all of these and moving up slowly up the ladder, or in this case, a stair-shaped ladder. The reason that is very important is because, like we talked about recently in the heritage speaker example, the reason many people are stressed out in those situations is because they're forced to perform in front of people. And they're also forced to perform in real time, to where when you say something wrong, you get a bad reaction. On the other hand, imagine if you're thinking in your head, well, who cares if you make an error? First of all, you're probably not even going to realize it. And if you realize it, you're like, okay, I'll just fix it and that's it. But when you start off with these top activities, you automatically get judged and you automatically feel like you have to perform, which automatically means that you're more stressed out and therefore you produce worse language. And what happens when you produce worse language? Well, you're going to feel bad. What happens when you feel bad? You're going to study less and you're going to output less. And so you're going to get even worse, and this kind of cycle continues. So I made this little ladder because when you do it correctly, and instead of starting off with one of these top two, which by the way is almost always what happens if you go to a language class, you're oftentimes in your first few weeks or months of learning a language, you're forced to speak in front of class or speak in front of a teacher and multiple other people, which is really stressful and a really bad experience. But if you move up with these correctly and in the right order, you will minimize stress. You'll pretty much always feel comfortable speaking because you are not doing anything that's way out of your comfort zone. You're just doing something that's a little bit out of your comfort zone. And you'll also be doing the most useful thing at every stage, because you don't need to be having full conversations just to get started producing language. And so let's go over each one of these one by one. The first one is internal monologues. And this is basically just thinking. It's you talking to yourself in your head or talking to someone else or whatever. And the pros of this is that you have infinite time to think. You have zero stress because no one hears your mistakes. You don't have to worry about pronunciation because you're not even putting the words out there. You're just keeping them in your head. And it helps you build sentences, start recalling words, and reflecting upon the language. You can ask yourself questions like, I wonder if... Let's say you're learning Spanish. I wonder if I'm supposed to use estar or ser here. There are two versions of the verb to be. A lot of times people conflate the two, but if you are thinking in your head, you can start creating sentences using both and just kind of being like, in real time, being like, no, I think this one fits better and blah, blah, blah. And it's very easy to do anytime. It counts as very good extra practice and it just gets you started combining words into sentences. The cons of it is that a lot of times you want some feedback when you're speaking, right? You want to be able to speak, you say something wrong, a teacher corrects you. That is very useful. And so you won't get that from here. But then again, you can do this way more often than you can speak with a teacher, because for a teacher, you need a teacher. For this, you just need yourself. And so it has some pros and cons. On top of that, a couple other cons is that it doesn't train your articulation, so you won't improve your accent by doing it really. And it's also hard to notice mistakes. So if you make a mistake, you could maybe not notice and therefore create bad habits. In general, though, I think this is a very good starter activity. When you're just starting out in a language, you don't need to be worried about having a perfect accent. You don't need to be worried about creating super long sentences and getting responses and thinking about what to say back and blah, blah. You just need to start doing something. And it's also a good filler activity for when you don't want to be the psycho talking to yourself outside. So, hey, if you want to be speaking to yourself while walking down the street, that's all on you and you can do that. But I think that it's pretty nice to, when you are somewhere, you're waiting in line at the grocery store, whatever, you can just start thinking, and it's a little bit of extra practice. So while the benefits aren't the highest, it's something, and it helps develop accuracy by creating simple sentences. Level 1.5 is repetition. And what I mean by repetition is stuff like shadowing, where you, for example, watch a video and you repeat what the person says in the video. So you're watching me and you say the exact same things as me and you try to mimic my accent, etc. That's good to train your accent and your articulation and kind of get used to moving your mouth in the correct way necessary to produce the sounds of the language. But I wouldn't necessarily call that output, because I could technically be shadowing a person speaking Chinese despite me not knowing any Chinese. And so, because there's no recall, it's not really output, but I do think that it's a solid way to bridge the gap between not having done a lot of speaking and kind of starting to build up that habit. It could also be, by the way, seeing a sentence written somewhere and just trying to pronounce it. That's also a form of repetition. But where it really starts to get interesting is in level 2, where we have self-talk and journaling. Basically what the name implies. You're either speaking to yourself or you are writing to yourself by either writing a journal or somewhere else. Doesn't really matter. The pros of this is that it adds physicality. So when you're thinking, yes, you are creating sentences, but you're not training your accent, you're not training your speaking skills, and you're not training your articulation. Some words might be really hard to pronounce, and you just might need to practice it 10, 20, 50 times to nail it. But the benefits here, compared to a real conversation, is that no one's judging you, right? So if you make a mistake, that's fine. And that makes it lower stress, which probably makes you, especially as a beginner, want to do it more, because you don't feel this sense of pressure to perform. On top of that, it also has a couple of unique benefits, which is that you can look back and notice mistakes. And so if you record yourself once in a while, you can see whenever you wanted to say something but couldn't. For example, you might imagine someone asking you what your hobbies are. And if your hobbies are skiing, working out, and cooking, you might notice that you don't know the verb for cooking, and you also don't know any ingredients. So you might want to learn more about that. Same thing if you've written it down in a journal. The cons, however, which there's only really one big one, is that there's no feedback. Now you are actually speaking compared to thinking, which is a huge thing. It's a huge step. But nobody's going to be able to correct you other than yourself. And a lot of times, you won't know what you're actually doing wrong. And you won't necessarily know, even when looking back, if there's another word that's more suitable. Unless you know that word and unless you're aware of it, right? But many times you won't be. So that's a con. Therefore, I would say that this kind of speaking practice is good for all levels, from beginner to advanced. And I think it should be a main output activity. Although it does not allow for feedback, it is very, very convenient. You won't always have a teacher available, and you won't always have someone like a friend or a language exchange partner to speak with and to correct you. And because of that, if you want to be regularly outputting and regularly practicing your speaking, you're going to have to do use some methods and strategies that might not be as ideal, but they're still fine and will allow you to maybe get in a couple more hours each week of practice. It also allows for recording, which is a huge thing. You can't always record your conversations. Your teacher might not be okay with it, although I assume many of them would be if you ask nicely. But still, it's easy to just sit down for, let's say, 10 minutes, 15 minutes every week, speak to the camera, and just kind of look back and see what are your weak spots and or weak points, and also measure progress. So this is an activity that I recommend you use a lot of, and one that I recommend you start off doing instead of real conversations. But we'll get to those soon. Level 3 is a little bit more scary, I'd say, and that is output with asynchronous feedback. So this is basically just whenever you are saying something to someone and the response that you get back is going to be delayed. Could be delayed by 1 hour, 2 hours, a whole day, or just a minute or two. But it's usually when you're chatting with someone or sending voice notes, for example. The benefit of this is that it's usually lower pressure than real-time speaking. Because if I'm speaking to you and I say some stupid shit and I use words that you never heard that are just correctly wrong, totally wrong, then you're going to have a confused look on your face right away. And me knowing that, especially as a beginner in a language, can make the act of speaking a pretty daunting thing. Because I know that I'm going to get judged right away. Well, here, if you're chatting with someone and you know that the response won't come until 5 hours later, then you don't really have this fear, and that can make you want to practice it more. On top of that, if you're chatting, you can always look at your sentence and kind of look back and adjust a thing, maybe change out one word for something else that you find a little bit more fitting, and you can also reflect upon what you've written afterwards. You get feedback and correction because you're actually speaking with a real person. And that also is pretty motivating because the whole goal of learning a language is to kind of connect with people, right? And so this is a very good bridge into speaking with real people and getting correction without it being too daunting. The cons of it, however, is that because you're not speaking, unless you're sending a voice note, you won't get the articulation practice. On top of that, it's also a little bit unreliable because you don't know how quick or slow the response time is going to be. Some people, and in some times, might respond in a minute or in 5 seconds if you're having a live chat with someone, right? In other times, they might be busy, they might not log into the app, and they might not even respond to you ever, right? They might ghost you. And so it's like, well, you don't know. Is this person going to be someone you're speaking with very actively, very often? Is it going to be a long conversation, short conversation? You don't know. But if you schedule like an hour with someone, or if you buy an hour of like a tutoring session on an app like italki or somewhere like that, then you know that, okay, I'm going to have a teacher to speak to for 1 hour. So that's a little bit more reliable. Plus, whenever we're speaking, we're not actively choosing the words to say. But when we're writing to someone, we can do that. So if all we do is write instead of speak with our mouth and in real time, we might not kind of train that real-time sentence creation. How I recommend using this is as an extra activity. Because it's not very reliable and because you don't really train that real-time sentence creation, you want to have some form of real speaking as kind of your main output activity. But I do think that it's a very good bridge into real conversations. So before actually speaking with anyone, I started chatting with people on HelloTalk. Not only did that kind of allow me to be like, okay, I'm actually having a conversation with a Japanese person or Spanish person, but it also made it so I could build up relationships with whom I could then kind of schedule a call with. And but I don't keep it as like my main activity. I very often speak to myself, and I very often speak with people, either in real life or scheduling like a voice or a video call, right? So this is something that you want to keep as an extra activity and not as your main activity. But it can improve your accuracy by thinking and getting some feedback. That's also why I recommend chatting a little bit with AI. I know a lot of people don't like AI, but it's a very good way of getting this kind of writing practice and even speaking practice. But in this case, we're talking about writing, while not kind of being judged right away and also getting good quality feedback. Level 4 is real-time output. And this is basically what it sounds like. It's a real conversation, essentially. The main pros here, which there are many, is that it's the most realistic form of practice. What we ultimately want to get to is to the point where we can have real conversations, connect with people, and speak in real time. And so to get good at that and to get fluent at doing that, we always need to practice that a lot. And there's really no substitute. It also gets us used to the pressure, because when we know that we've been able to have 1 hour conversations, we've been able to mess up, and we've done all that, we've gotten corrected, we've improved over time, then whenever it's time to use the language in our real lives, we're already used to that. We've already failed a bunch of times, and we know that we're capable of speaking. It's also very fun and rewarding, and it combines listening, thinking, and speaking, because you first have to think about what to say, then you gotta say it out loud, and then you also gotta understand and listen to the person respond, and do something called negotiation of meaning, which is a term that basically describes the whole thing where someone says something, you don't fully understand them, you ask like, hey, what did you mean exactly? Could you explain it in a different way? Then they explain it in a different way, and you maybe sometimes have to be like, how do I say this? I don't know how to say this, and you ask a question, and blah, blah, blah. It's basically this back and forth where you're trying to be understood and you're trying to understand the other person. And this is basically how we communicate. And that's also a large portion of it's also a large portion of the practice that children get to get good at speaking, because they don't come out the womb just being perfect, right? They say something and then their parent is like, "Oh, did you mean this thing?" And then they might be like, "Yeah, I meant that thing." And they're like, "Oh, okay, cool," and blah blah. And they say it back to you. And if you say something wrong, one of your parents might be like, "Oh no, it's called this thing," and blah blah. And so this feedback and this kind of back and forth is extremely useful. But it has some cons. Primarily that it's high stress. Because like we said with the output with asynchronous feedback, there it's like you don't get this confused face, but here you do. And so if you say something and it's wrong, the other person is going to react to that right away and be like, "What do you mean?" And that can be pretty daunting, but it can be lowered with a patient person. That's why, especially if you're a little bit worse at the language and if you haven't gotten that far yet and you're not that used to speaking, I would recommend finding someone who's either very chill, like an exchange partner who's just very chill, or a tutor who's used to speaking with beginners, because then they're used to mistakes and they're used to correcting them and they're used to kind of all of that, right? But yeah, the mistakes will be public and they'll be immediate, and so that is always going to be a little bit more stressful than not having that not be the case. On top of that, you could freeze, you could stutter, you could be like, "Oh, I don't remember the word," etc., etc. And it also requires finding and scheduling time, which might not always be possible. You might not always have the money to like schedule multiple tutoring sessions a week. You might not always find someone, especially if you're learning maybe a smaller language, or if your language itself is a little bit less common. You might not always find someone like an exchange partner to speak with, and the times might not align, etc., etc. And so it's a little bit less flexible than just speaking with yourself, because you can do that on the toilet, in the shower, out in the street, while exercising, while whatever. I mean, you can do it whenever, right? Or thinking in your head. But this you can't. And so for that reason, I don't think it should usually be your main activity, because it's hard to set up, it's expensive, it's a little bit harder to do on the fly, and it should also primarily be used by intermediates and above. And that is because it is going to be stressful, pretty much. And you also don't really need to do it if you're a beginner, right? But if you are a beginner and you want to do this, and maybe you've already spoken a little bit with yourself, etc., etc., I would recommend doing it with tutors, like I said, because they're usually a little bit more patient and used to that. And ultimately, you should start doing this whenever you're ready to make real relationships and really level up. It doesn't have to be your first activity, and you sure as hell don't have to do it in your first month of learning, because it is going to be very stressful. If you want to do that, do it with tutors, but it's not necessary. And what is especially not necessary is level 5, performative speaking. And this is kind of like an extra level. It doesn't usually benefit language learners, but people often start with it. What is the main thing here? It is basically whenever you're speaking in front of people and you're trying to perform. Right now I'm speaking in front of the camera, which means multiple people, and I'm trying to sound good when I speak, right? That's usually not an issue when it's your native language or language you're good at, and it can have some benefits there, but if you're trying to just get good at a language, there's really no point, because it's increased pressure, it's increased stress. For what? Why do you have to speak in front of your class instead of just speaking with one person? It doesn't really make much sense. And so I added it here just to show that this is what people usually start with, and then they're like, "Oh, why don't I feel comfortable speaking?" Because you're doing the hardest thing as the first thing. This is not what you start with. You don't start by speaking at the dinner table in front of your whole family who expect you to be good at the language. You mix these activities in your own way. Just know your own level and know what you can handle, then progress accordingly. And I'll give you some more specific tips later. But just make sure that whatever you do and whatever mix of these you have, whether you start with internal monologues, you start with self-talk, you do mostly this or mostly that or whatever, speak a lot and just don't worry about making too many mistakes, because it's par for the course. But there's one thing you gotta avoid that can ruin your fluency, and it is what I call the speaking fallacy. People think that you get fluent by one of two extremes. Some say, just speak every day, bro. Just start speaking from day one and speak as much as you can. And others will say the complete opposite. Nah, man, just learn and wait 5 years before saying your first word, because If you say one thing too early, like you're doomed forever. And both of these guys are completely wrong, honestly, although they both make some good points. The truth about output is pretty simple. You have to speak to get good at speaking. Shocker. But it can also be stressful, which I've said now a billion times. And fundamentally, this is very important to understand. Fundamentally, output is about recalling language, not building it. If I only know 100 words, me speaking for 10 billion hours won't automatically take those 100 and make them 10,000. Because I haven't heard them. I need to hear them. I need to process them in my own head to learn and understand more words and more grammar. And that means that you have to understand to speak. And the less you understand, the less you can say. So if I know 10,000 words and I try to speak, then I can use probably around 2,000 words because of that 20% ratio that we talked about before. Which also means that if I only know 1,000 words, no matter how much I speak, even if I get that to if I get those 1,000 words to 100% activation, activation sounds like some, I don't know. If I basically go from being able to just understand 1,000 words and speak 200 to now being able to speak all of those words, I'm still just speaking 1,000 words, and I'm not speaking as much as what I would be speaking if I knew 10,000 words instead. What I want to say by that is that the more words you understand, the more you can say, and vice versa. And because of that, you have to continue learning via input and studying, so that you kind of accrue new ingredients, but you also can't ignore speaking, which is how you use them well. And that's like me spending all my time getting the best steak possible and then cooking it with like a clothing iron. Sure, it's the best steak possible, but like the way that I'm using it in is dog shit. And the same way, if I go and pick up a pile of dog shit and I give it to Gordon Ramsay, yes, he's like a very good chef, right? But it's still a pile of dog shit at the end of the day, so he's not going to be able to use it that well. On top of that, speaking early can also create some bad habits, especially if you speak by yourself and you don't get corrections. And I'll cover that exact speaking timeline later, like when you start speaking, etc., etc. And none of this matters unless you truly know how to apply it. Which brings us to section 3, the BEP method. This is going to be your complete language learning system and the method for learning languages that I have found and developed and improved upon over the past years of learning. This is what I believe to be the most complete method of learning a language because it covers all the aspects of the fluency equation and it implements all the best principles necessary to learn vocabulary, to learn grammar, input and output, all in one method, flexible and adaptable to you, your goals, and your interests. First of all, we have to understand why other methods fail. Up until this point, we've gone over the fluency equation and how to use studying input and output in the best way possible, but I still haven't given you a concrete method to follow. And that's because I believe that most people fail by jumping straight to the method, just blindly trying to copy other methods without knowing how or if they even work in the first place. Basically just doing stuff. But instead, I believe that we should try and reverse engineer it, looking at the people failing, seeing what they're doing, noticing patterns, and also trying to come up with the necessary and most important principles to actually succeed in learning a language, and then creating a method from that is suited to our interests and our goals while kind of maintaining all the most important principles and avoiding all the most common mistakes. And so to build the best plan possible for you and your goals, we gotta know why other methods fail. And I'm willing to bet that it's probably not what you think. Let's go over each method that fails one by one and just kind of notice a few things and see what they have in common. The first one being the so-called grammar translation method. This is the most common one, this is the one that you see in school, and it's basically just memorizing word lists, drilling grammar rules, and focusing on translation. The second one are immersion methods, and there are a few different ones, but they're usually input and output, mostly input or only input with very little output, and also very little study. They realize that just studying doesn't work, and so They kind of lower that a lot, but they pretty much only do input. And then there's other people who are like, okay, just doing input is cool, but like it leaves you really bad at speaking. And we want to get good at speaking, so let's just speak a lot. Let's speak from day one. They make mistakes and they learn from them, and they basically see everything else as supplementary. And then there's a do-it-all method. They realize that other methods are kind of unnecessarily restrictive, and they see the value in studying, they see the value in input, they see the value in output. So they combine everything. And this sounds good, but it has a lot of problems too. Most importantly here, these methods sound different, but they all have something in common. Let's look at it real quick again. Grammar translation. This is the list of activities that they do. Immersion methods, this is what they do. Speaking, this is what they do. And do it all, this is what they do. Well, the thing that they have in common is that they're all static. They all ignore prioritization and personalization. The grammar translation method is like, let's study, let's translate, let's learn these things. The input method is like, just do a lot of input. Speaking, just do a lot of speaking. And the mix it all method is like, okay, let's do it all and let's just combine them. But like, that's it. They basically just have you spamming a few things. And the fourth gives you a little mix, but it still doesn't tell you when or how to do things different at all. They just say, do these activities, and that's it. But here's the truth. At every point in life in general, with whatever you're doing, there's always going to be something that gives you a higher ROI than everything else. I, in another video, used the example of this like 6'5" supermodel who can't get a date. And so he's like buying new Gucci shirts and blah, blah, trying to just look better essentially. But he's kind of ignoring the fact that he just hasn't taken a shower in like 5 years. And so that sounds kind of extreme and silly, and it is, but many times people just kind of do stuff and they continue to do the same stuff, thinking that, okay, they're not getting better, or rather, they're not where they are, so they're just going to do more. Sometimes that's true, but sometimes it's not. And so if your method doesn't change over time and adapt to your goals, and if you don't plan with this in mind, you're going to waste ages doing stuff that's good on paper, but not what you actually need, and also not what you actually need in that moment. And that's what the BEP method fixes. So the BEP method is essentially a combination of the best activities, but tailored to you and constantly changing, prioritizing the things that you actually need the most right then and there. And so it has three stages: the build stage, expand stage, and perfect stage. And I look at it like building a house. You first gather the materials, you gather the tools, you understand the basic skills, and then you form the general structure. Only then, after having gathered the tools and forming the structure, only after that do you start decorating it and kind of adding the finishing touches. You never add flower pots and a TV to a house that doesn't even have a roof, doesn't even have a floor, nothing like that, right? Because it's useless. That's not like the purpose of a house, and if you have nothing to add it to, you don't even know what it's going to look like. And so BEP will give you structure and an order that actually teaches you what you need exactly at the right time. This is important to understand too. I'm not going to give you a fixed method and a fixed timeline because we're all different. So what I will give you is a general plan that you can tweak for your goals and lifestyle essentially. Reaching a basic level in 3 months is going to be very different from native fluency in 5 to 10 years. And because of that, at the end of each stage, instead of giving you an exact amount of time to spend in that stage, I'm going to give you a simple system for knowing when to move on to the next. So, the BP method will essentially just be the best activities and the best things to do at the exact right time for you, customizable, which I believe is the best way to learn a language. Let's start off with the building stage. This is the first stage. The B stands for build, and the goal here is to build a base that makes everything after this way easier. The time split is going to be something like 60% studying, 30% input, and 10% output. although these are very general and they could change a little bit depending on your goal, etc., and what you like. This is going to be your first few months of studying. And exactly how long it is, I'll talk about it at the end. The do's and don'ts. In this stage, you don't bother with advanced grammar, you don't learn slang, you don't work on your accent too much, you don't learn too many complicated words, and you don't really try to become a master at anything specific. Instead, you just focus on learning the basics. You just focus on slowly getting used to hearing the language, building good habits and getting motivated, and basically just setting your future self up for success. Making it as easy for yourself as possible to do all the things that you want to do in the future, like understanding and speaking and doing all that, right? Learning the basics. So what this means is that you want to spend some time when you're new to a language, just being aware of any big differences from that language and your native language. Like if that language has plural or not, if it has gender for certain words, if it has a different word order. Maybe there's a bunch of ways to conjugate verbs or very few ways to conjugate verbs. Just spending like an hour or 2 or 3 or 10 or 20 kind of learning some of these things. You don't have to master them, but just being aware of them will save you a lot of time later. Basic phonetics is also a good idea to learn, like the fact that in Japanese, for example, V's turn into B's and L's turn into R's. If you learn that, and also the fact that words don't end with a consonant, unless it's N, you will automatically understand when you hear words like hoteru, that is hotel. Doesn't end in hotelu, it becomes hoteru. And same for video turns into video. This is not a lot, like it doesn't take a long time to learn, but that's a huge payoff. It matters because it gives you the lay of the land. It just gets you aware of like, okay, here's how this language is different. Here are the things that I gotta pay attention to. And it helps you understand and notice stuff quicker. If you learn these things right away, you're gonna be able to notice when you're watching a video, like, okay, this person pronounced this a little bit differently, but that's how you pronounce things in this language because it's different in X and Y way. How you do this is by using a structured resource for the grammar and quote-unquote quirks of the language. And you might also spend some time researching the sounds and the script of the language independently. When I say quirks, by the way, I just mean like kind of quote-unquote weird differences between the language. Like how in Japanese you don't say the person's, or you don't say you usually say the person's name or the person's position instead. You say like Mr. Customer or whatever. You don't say like, hey, you, don't, or like take off your shoes. You're like, dearest customer, would you please take off your shoes? Just being aware of that will make it so that whenever you hear someone say that to you or you hear it in a movie or whatever, you're like, oh yeah, there's this interesting thing that I read about. And also it avoids you looking like a douchebag just saying something that's not appropriate, right? And so how you do this specifically with examples is, for example, by using textbook like Genki for learning Japanese, or an app like Language Transfer. There's a little typo here, but it's Language Transfer for Spanish and Italian. That's how I did it. And I also used YouTube videos for extra stuff, like these kind of quirks, like, 10 ways to say I or you in Japanese, right? However you do this doesn't really matter. Like, the main thing here, I hope you are noticing this pattern. I don't give a shit about the exact ways of doing things. I give a shit about the principles that work. So it's like, if you want to use a textbook or an online course or an app or whatever, so long as you're kind of following these things, like you're learning some of the basics, it doesn't matter how you do it. Just do it, right? Same thing here. You want to learn common words in the language. This basically just means learning to recognize the rough meaning of the most common 1,000-ish words. Could be 500, could be 2,000. Sort of depends on how long you're staying in this stage for. You don't have to master them, just be aware of them and kind of understand them. That's the goal. This matters because they're always going to show up. So putting some effort up front will give you a huge advantage later. And you do this by using a resource with recall, so that you are not just kind of reading one translation from another, like you actually have to think about what the word means. And it also includes context, like an example sentence or some notes, etc. And ideally, it should also be spaced out. And Anki does all of these things automatically. I talked about Anki before in the vocabulary section, and I recommend it, but there's multiple other resources as well, other apps that are similar, etc. There's already pre-made decks for languages like Japanese, Spanish, maybe like Chinese, very common languages. But you can also use my vocabulary tool. There's a link in the description where you just insert whatever language you're learning, what level you're at, and it will create Anki cards for you, ready to be imported into Anki for free. Aim for 5 to 20 new words a day, and just don't go crazy here. Don't try to learn 100 to 500 new words a day, and don't try to like fully master every single word in your first week of learning. Just follow the previous vocabulary recommendations that I made earlier. I also want to note here that because you're early in your journey, probably, the main bottleneck is going to be how many words you understand. And so aiming for kind of the higher range here is fine, because me as an advanced learner of, let's say English, for example, sure, are there some very unusual kind of niche words that I could be learning? Yes. But if I try to learn 20 of those a day, because they show up so infrequently, that would be very hard. On the other hand, if I'm new to a language and I learned 20 words a day, they're going to show up all the time in my textbook. They're going to show up when I watch something. They're going to show up if I have a conversation. So it's going to be easier. And therefore, I think that aiming for the higher end of this range right now is fine, and dialing that down a little bit later, which I'll talk about too. But yeah, this is a core activity in this stage. So combining learning common words with learning the kind of quirks and the grammar of the language is going to be what gives you most of the gains in this stage. And that's also why you spend around 60% of your time doing those things. But you also want to start listening. Just start hearing and getting used to how the language sounds in spoken form, doing some input. This matters because if you spend all your time in a textbook, you're going to sound really odd when you try to start speaking, because all you can think about it are like these translations and these rules and blah, blah. And you also have trouble understanding words and rules you learned because all you know are the exact definitions. You haven't really gotten the full context of how they're used. So context that you get from listening and hearing people speak about them and use these words in real life will really make stuff stick and click and help you really understand stuff on a deeper level that just studying them can't do. How do you do this? Well, I recommend beginner comprehensible input channels. You can oftentimes just search for beginner comprehensible input, Spanish, French, German, Japanese, whatever, and many channels will have these ordered in order of like complete beginner, beginner, intermediate, advanced. So just slowly move up this these levels of difficulty and try to find stuff that you understand, but don't fully understand, right? Like the previous input recommendations. Just don't do any native content. Focus on slow, simple visual content for beginners. Native content will be way too difficult and you won't learn much at all. I use a channel called Dreaming Spanish for Spanish. I use a channel called Comprehensible Japanese and Japanese with Shun and a bunch of others for Japanese. But yeah, just go onto YouTube, search for beginner Spanish or beginner Chinese, whatever, and you'll probably find some. Also watch podcasts. I added that at the end. Or watch, what am I saying? Listen to podcasts. They're good for when you're on the go, getting in some more input. But you also want to start producing. What this is just using simple low pressure output, using that output difficulty ladder that we talked about before, while focusing on accurate and basic speech. For example, you can basically just start saying some preset sentences like you want to say, I like doing this thing, or I like pasta, or I like movies, etc. Just to get you starting to speak. That's very important because what it does is that it helps you remember what you learn. A lot of people downplay the importance of speaking, and like, I'm not one of those people who tell you that you gotta speak 24/7 to learn a language. There are very many other important things too, but one of the most well-researched things in learning science is the power of recall, where you basically learn a bunch of things and then you sit down and without any kind of help from anything else, you recall these things and go from zero to something basically. So like I'm sitting here, I'm not doing anything, and I just have to pull these words that I've previously learned out of my head and produce them. The act of doing that and of recalling knowledge and creating it basically is super, super beneficial for truly cementing that knowledge in your head. and just making sure to remember it way better, essentially. And so if you don't produce a lot, even in the beginning, that's fine, but you're just going to be learning slower. Another advantage of it is that you are lowering the barrier for when you want to start speaking for real. If you've already spoken a little bit in your first, let's say, 2 months, you don't need to start from like day one. I think that's pretty unnecessary. But let's say you've been learning for 3 weeks. You start speaking very slowly. You speak a little bit more after like 2 months, 3 months, etc. Well, then after 6 months to a year, when you can actually have full conversations, it's not going to be like this huge task going from just learning to now speaking. You're already going to be somewhat used to it. And so I think you should start by saying preset sentences. Like if you learned a new grammar rule or word, just try to use it in a sentence. Repeat stuff here and there, like if you, for example, are using Duolingo, let's say, just for fun or whatever, or you're in a textbook and there's a sentence there, just try and say it out loud to get used to pronouncing it. Here, you really don't want to have any kind of long conversations or worry about like very complex things. Like, just get used to the basics, pronouncing things, saying things very slowly, creating very, very basic sentences. Mainly, like I said here, to have some sort of recall in your program and also to lower the barrier for when you want to start speaking for real. But probably the biggest priority in this stage is going to be sticking to it. Because most people will quit here. That's the truth. Probably you will too. That's the honest truth. Like, especially if you don't do this, you'll probably quit here. Because most people do. Most people don't pull through with it. And most people don't continue until they've truly learned the language. Because it takes time. But if you want to give yourself the best chances of doing that, you want to spend some time upfront making sure you build good solid habits that can carry you through to fluency, and also spending some time doing fun stuff that will build your motivation up. It's okay if some of your input is going to be with L1 subtitles, like your native subtitles. Yes, it's not the most effective thing ever, but there's a big reason a bunch of anime nerds get fluent in Japanese. It's because they freaking love anime and they want to watch it. And so it's like, if you find, let's say, an artist in a language, let's say you find a French rapper or some shit, and it's like, oh wow, like me listening to this person really makes me want to learn more French, then by all means, spend some time listening to that person. That's going to keep you motivated and just kind of keep your mind on French and on learning French. That's great. It's also okay to use some like Duolingo or some random gamified app if you like them. It's okay to watch some random videos about the country or language if you enjoy them. I used to watch this reality show in Japanese that I really liked, first with English subtitles, because I found it. I tried to watch it with Japanese subtitles. This was like a few years ago, and it was pretty difficult, so I started watching it with English subtitles. And yeah, was it the most productive thing? Probably not, but I still learned a few things here and there, and it kept me motivated, and it gave me a goal of like, I want to understand this show with Japanese subtitles. The truth is that a fired up, consistent learner will always beat the hyper-optimizing, overthinking, try-hard Johnny Bookworm. That's the guy who's super preoccupied with everything being perfect all the time and who can't do a single thing that's fun because, well, it has to be optimal, and you can't be doing this one thing because what if you could learn 3 more words using this app that's really boring instead of this thing? Like, just do basic shit, like have some good fundamentals in your program, have some good fundamentals as a part of your routine, do them, make sure you're studying, make sure you're doing some input, speaking, etc. If you then want to fill some more of that up with stuff that you like, do that. Like, that's going to keep you consistent, that's going to keep you motivated, and you'll study 5 times more hard than this Johnny Bookworm guy, whoever that is, and you'll get better results. But now the question is, how do we combine these? And when do we move on from this build stage? So I'm not going to give you a routine to copy, an exact one, because that's not the best way to learn, and I trust that you're smart enough to build one yourself. But some rough guidelines and principles for how you want to structure this build stage is that you roughly want to split it between 60% studying, 30% input, and 10% output. If you're studying 2 hours a day, that could look roughly like 45 minutes of a textbook, 15 minutes of Anki, 15 minutes of a YouTube grammar video, 30 minutes of output, and then some kind of AI output practice. Just chatting with an AI being like, hey, was this sentence correct? And they say, No, it was a little bit wrong here, blah, blah, blah. You can improve this. And you're like, okay, cool, etc., right? Once again, this is just a very rough guideline. I don't recommend keeping it all in one day either, because some days you're just going to feel like sitting down and watching some YouTube. If you want to do that, then just do that, right? Do more input that day. And other days, you might have like a 1 hour call with a tutor scheduled, and so you're going to do more output, right? But this is a very rough guideline. You want to see this stage as a fun speedrun stage. Basically just learning the basics as fast as possible while not burning out and while enjoying yourself, and making sure you sprinkle in some fun stuff here and there. It's like a diet. If you only diet with like, only broccoli and freaking no seasoning and whatever, it's like, okay, cool, try that, but you're gonna burn yourself out, right? So you might want to keep in one of your favorite foods. It doesn't have to be 3 kilos of candy every single day, but like something could be smart while still getting to your goal pretty much as fast as possible, right? And the timeline of how long this takes really depends on you. I can't say. I'd be lying if I said it. But it's like roughly 20 to 30% of your long-term goal if it's a moderate one. With that, I mean that, for example, your goal is learning B2 Spanish. That's a pretty moderate goal. It's solid, but it's not like native level. And it's also not like A1 level, just very, very basic, like, hello, my name is this. It's a moderate goal. And your goal is to learn that in a year, which means 2 to 3 hours of studying every day, because it takes around 1,000 hours. Well, in that case, take those 1,000 hours and take 20% of that, which is 200 hours, right? So it's probably going to take you somewhere around 200 hours to complete the stage. And if you're studying 2.5 hours a day, that will be 2 to 3 months. With that being said, it's like maybe some days you're studying a little bit more, maybe some days you're studying a bit less, blah, blah. And so it's very individual, but somewhere around there. But hard languages like Japanese, Chinese, etc. will probably take you like 3 to 4 times as long. So be aware of that. And also, if your goal is like A2, B1, like a lower level of like very basic fluency, if you will, or just speaking about very simple everyday topics, then you probably want to stay here longer proportionately. So if that goal might take you like 300 hours, then perhaps you want to spend like 200 hours here or 150 hours here, because you're not going to need as much advanced practice and stuff like that, right? And in the same way, like vice versa, if your goal is native level, let's say C2, C1, you probably want to spend a shorter time here proportionately, because otherwise you'd be spending like 1,000 hours here, right? And so reasonable range is to spend a few dozen to a few hundred hours here. And you move on to expand by using the theory of constraints and asking yourself, what is holding me back right now? Move on if you know basic words in grammar, you can say basic things, and you can understand basic slow speech. Stay if you struggle with that. Pretty damn simple, really. Those are the goals of this stage, and when you understand them, or when you can do them, you're free to move on. And you're moving on to the expand stage. That is stage number 2, and the goal here is to deepen the knowledge you already have, to understand the grammar that you already know even better, to understand the words you already know even better, and to expand on that knowledge, to go from just being able to speak about very simple topics to now a more wide array of topics, and also to go from very basic to real world usage. You might right now know the translation of a bunch of words, but do you really know how to recall them on the fly and to understand them when you're watching a movie? Probably not. That's what we're going to do here. The time split here is 60-20-20. 60% input, 20% studying, 20% output. That's a lot less studying and it's a lot more input. Because right now, what is the constraint? It is real world usage, not just knowing the basics. So we gotta do more real world shit. You feel me? And so, the do's and don'ts. You don't study as much anymore. You dial back textbooks, you dial back the grammar courses, and you don't stick to only basic input and basic speaking exercises. Instead, you go from rules and translations to real world usage, you go from slow speech to automatic speech, and you start living in the language. So you gotta do things that help you get to those destinations, essentially. And here is where the real fun begins. Up until this point, You've basically just been studying, setting yourself up for success. And here's where we start to reap the rewards of that. You're going to start finding your favorite artists, your favorite musicians, your favorite YouTubers, your favorite TV shows. You're going to start making friends in the language, speaking, and just doing more real stuff. And really living your life in the language, feeling like you truly speak it. The real engine of progress in this stage is going to be input. We've already gone over it in depth before, but so I'm not gonna discuss all the details of how to use input. Just watch the previous section for that. And if you skipped all the way here, go back and watch that. It's important. I'm just kidding. Stay here a little bit longer if you want. You're always welcome. But the main constraint here isn't words and rules. It is not understanding real speech. And so that's why we shift from 30% input to 60% input. Because real life is messy. It's not going to be as simple as one word plus this word plus that grammar rule equals we understand it. No, sometimes we just won't. So we got to put ourselves in a situation where we're forced to decode and understand real language in real time and get used to doing that automatically. Because we also don't have time to recall all grammar rules mid-conversation. That's what we want to make them. We want to make ourselves subconsciously understand them and not just have to rely on our cognitive faculties, essentially. The progression here is that we go from slow and controlled input in the beginning of the stage, because mind you, when we move on to this stage, we're probably still only 2 to 3 to 4 months in, to then later going to more messier conversational inputs, and later even native input. That can be that in the first stage we were watching stuff like, this is an eye, I have 2 eyes, blah blah, to then going to hello, today I am gonna cook food, and you are going to come with me, blah blah, to then native input where it's I'm gonna cook food today, welcome fam, blah, you know what I mean? And so that's obviously very hard in the beginning, but yeah, it's important to know at the end because some people speak like that. So we want to start with beginner to intermediate videos made for learners, but with a more natural pace. So like I said, in the beginning, we're going to have those kind of pointing and drawing videos where it's very, very slow. And they're made for learners, yes, but they're made for very, very new beginners. Now we're still kind of a beginner, but we need a little bit more of a conversational pace. So there's a bunch of channels out there who make vlogs that are for learners, but it's them speaking kind of normally, just with a lower amount of words and kind of more basic words, essentially. And so they still pronounce stuff very clearly, they still use limited vocab, but it's just not absurdly slow. Watch these for a few months, and then you transition into simpler native content. Yes, already, I put there. Native content sounds scary, but like I said, let's say you move on to this stage after 3 months, then you watch these for a few months, more conversational stuff, then you move on to native content. You're 6 months in, and you can do it. So there's an important thing you have to do here that I call crossing the chasm. This is basically going from that comfortable spot where you are using learner content, you're using textbooks, simpler videos, etc., and jumping over, taking that uncomfortable jump over to native content. And it's always going to be uncomfortable until you jump. That's the point. And to illustrate that, I want to tell you about a guy who booked a coaching call with me a while back. Now, this guy had been learning Chinese for about 3 years, every day pretty much, for at least an hour or two. He was doing a lot of solid stuff. He was very diligent and he was doing good. It looked like a very solid routine. But the problem was that despite being able to have hour-long conversations with tutors and stuff like that, and also understand learner content, whenever someone spoke to him in fast Chinese, and whenever he tried to watch native content, he really struggled. And so I dug a little deeper, and I found that he basically never went past learner content because it felt really hard for him. So I just told him, it's always going to feel hard. You just need to do it a lot more. And because you already understand so much Chinese, because you can already speak so much Chinese, the problem is not that you don't know the language, the problem is that you just haven't done this thing. And so that is your highest priority right now. And a few weeks later, he emailed me and he said that he already saw a massive difference. And he could finally understand when someone talked to him in fast, natural Chinese. I believe he even sent me another email after that saying it's improving even more right now and I feel way more comfortable than I thought I would. So while it might sound scary to go to native input, especially after like 6 months, a year, or whatever, it's gonna feel scary even after 3 years. So you just need to do it at some point. And you need to understand and accept that you won't understand everything that's being said for a little while. That's normal. And so the input strategy in the expand stage is to start with simple stuff, or rather, you start with very, very simple stuff in the build stage, and then you go to learner content that's still simple but a little bit more natural here, and then later you go on to simple native input. You also want to apply narrow input, which we talked about in the input stage before. And you also want to be aware of the person and the topic. Some accents are going to be way harder. I remember that when I, not when I started, but like half a year in, something like that, of learning Spanish, I found this Mexican dude who made like food videos. And he was really easy to understand, I thought. I was like, oh shit, like I understand a lot. This is really cool. I'm actually watching native content. And so then I found another, I believe also Mexican dude who made food videos. And I understood basically jack shit. Like he was way more difficult. He spoke a lot quicker, but also just the way he pronounced things and like the way he spoke, it was just way more difficult. And so some people are just way like harder to understand. So you can watch native content without it having to necessarily be very difficult. And you can also watch native content that's super hard. So you're just going to find the right native content. Same thing with topics. Some topics are broader and have more specific vocabulary. So just pick wisely. And also start reading a little bit. And more importantly, listen to a shit ton of podcasts. But you want to keep these for learners. You don't necessarily want to go over to native podcasts because they don't have the visuals that videos do. So they're going to be inherently harder. And the supplement to input is going to be studying here. Because by now you've already learned all the high ROI stuff. So studying is not going to give you that like massive boost in comprehension that it would in the build stage. Which means that you can still learn grammar, but just less or not at all from like one structured resource. So you don't need to keep repeating the same textbook or buy the second version of a textbook or third version of a textbook. It's not going to be as useful as just learning the basics there. Instead, you want to learn grammar kind of instinctively. Like you see a rule or a specific conjugation of a verb, let's say, used in a YouTube video you're watching. You're like, I don't really understand it. Then you Google it real quick. You're like, okay, I understand it now. Then you go on to watching. You see it a few more times and you're like, okay, I got it. And then, maybe it's not fully learned. So maybe you'll have to look it up once again in the future. Or maybe when you see it in 7 hours or you see it in like 3 days, whatever, you're going to be able to recognize like, there's that word again. Or that rule again. And also, when you make mistakes in your output, you're also going to want to work a little bit on that. So studying is no longer this thing that you spend a shit ton of time doing every week and dedicating time to it and like going through a structured textbook or whatnot. Instead, it should be something that you do whenever you notice that you need it. This is what screws a lot of learners up. They just keep studying. It's like you don't need to explicitly learn a bunch of academic vocabulary if all you want to do is have a normal conversation. You don't need to memorize all these like super complex grammar rules that like nobody knows. Like it's totally unnecessary. Yes, if you notice that, okay, I really need this grammar rule to even understand basic like movies and it shows up all the time, by all means learn it. Most of those you would have already learned from your textbook because like the most basic things are often introduced very, very early. But sure, if there's one that you missed, learn it instinctively. But like, yeah, it just kind of, it's unnecessary. So that's why we want to follow these kind of principles. And for vocab, it's sort of the same thing. You want to continue doing it, but just a little bit less, especially from a pre-made deck. So using a pre-made Anki deck, that's totally fine, and you can continue doing it. But it's like, if you've learned the 1,000 most common words, sometimes learning the 1,057th most common word will be a little bit less useful than learning the 1,752nd most common word, because that might be something that you personally would use more often. And the way that you determine that by is by seeing it in your input. So like, I recommend creating a separate deck in Anki here for words that you see in your input. So if you regularly see a word in your input, you don't know it, you can look it up, you can add it into Anki yourself. And there, in that way, you still get some general vocab practice, by continuing with your pre-made deck and kind of doing it in order of how common it is, but you also get some personalized practice depending on the kind of input that you watch. If you watch a lot of input about sports, you might want to learn more sports vocabulary specifically because maybe that's what you want to do. Like maybe you want to move to a country and play like basketball professionally. I don't know what you want to do, right? But we all have different goals, and therefore it's kind of silly to be like, no, you have to learn these words. Like, no, learn whatever words you want to know. That's ultimately what's going to be most useful for you. And what this does, this is interesting, okay? What learning in this way does is that it creates a feedback loop with narrow input where you see a word in your input because, by the way, like I told you before, you want to pick a limited amount of topics. So if you're watching mainly sports content, let's say, you're going to see a word in your sports video, for example. You're going to be like, I didn't know that word. Let me add it to Anki. By the way, only add words that you think you're genuinely going to need, right? Don't add a bunch of stupid shit. Like, I mean, like, okay, I'm not going to go into that, but like, you know what I mean? Like, if you see a word and it's like pterodactyl, what's that dinosaur called? What, pterodactyl? Like, you don't need to learn that word, right? But if it's like ball for football, let's say, yeah, learn that, right? Anyways, you see a word, you're like, okay, I want to learn that. You add it to your Anki. You then remember it better because it's in your Anki and you practice it a few times. Then you'll see it again in your content, maybe the day after. You're going to reinforce it because now you studied it a few times, you've seen it a few times, blah, blah, blah. That means you increase your comprehension of the content because you now know one more word, which means that when the comprehension of the content is better, you will be able to pick up even more words from that content. And this kind of cycle repeats. When you pick up more words, you kind of add them to Anki, you remember them, blah, blah, blah. So that's one of the most powerful ways to learn vocabulary, in my opinion, because you're constantly going to be exposed to similar words in like one topic in input, which gives you the context, and you're going to be explicitly repeating them in Anki, and it's going to be the words that you need. And yeah, it's just like a flywheel that keeps going, like, and they kind of improve on each other. Output is going to be used for activation and reinforcement at this stage. Here's where you really want to start actively outputting and regularly outputting. Specifically doing it with others for feedback. Previously, you just kind of repeated some stuff out loud, blah, blah, blah. But here you actually want to start the practice of having real conversations and getting corrected and stuff like that, right? And so ideally, you have a mix of a lot of self-talk, self-writing, and also regularly talk to exchange partners and tutors. That's because obviously speaking to yourself or chatting, or like not chatting, but like writing something down is going to be more convenient than scheduling a time with someone to speak with them. And so, but you still want that for the correction. And so I believe that a mix of these is a good idea here. And you're probably also going to be ready because you've kind of leveled up to it, right? You started speaking to yourself, or rather, yeah, like you started repeating stuff and you started thinking and doing stuff like that, basic sentences, and then you do a lot of self-talk, and then you kind of go on to having full conversations. You don't go straight to full conversations in your first month of learning. And so remember, this is 20% of your studying, but it doesn't mean you have to sit on Zoom calls for 20% of the time, okay? It can mean a mix of just talking to yourself a little bit, recording a short video, chatting with a friend, etc., just so it doesn't feel like, oh shit, I'm gonna study for 20 hours this week. I need to like schedule 4 Zoom calls with someone like that. You don't have to do that. And also, 20% output or 20 or 60% input or whatever, they aren't exact numbers. They're just rough guidelines. And the most important thing here with output and during the whole kind of BP method is just building the habit of creating and not just consuming language. That's especially important in the expand section, because by the end of the section, you want to be like relatively good at the language. And you can't be relatively good if you never created language. So you want to ramp it up over time as you learn more and more, because that's when it's going to be more useful. This is an important point, so I'm going to explain it a little bit. A lot of people speak a lot in the beginning, and that's fine. But the more words you know, the closer you're going to be to the final stage where you're going to even be able to have conversations. Like in your first month of speaking, no matter what you do, you're not going to be able to use the language like you want to be able to do in the end, right? Like you're not gonna be fluent in a month or two, no matter what you do. And because of that, it's like, do you spend a ton of time speaking? You could, but I think it's better to focus more time on fixing your main constraint, which is just learning more words and more grammar and understanding stuff better, since you're not going to be able to have full conversations anyways. And then when you get closer to the point of being able to have full conversations, that's when you really ramp up the practice, because now you've already acquired all the ingredients and you just got to learn how to use them, essentially. That's what I mean by that. Now, let's put it all together and kind of make the expand stage a little bit more structured. So expand is where you're going to build most of your abilities and where you're going to go from a learner to a speaker of the language. You'll still be far from perfect, but the goal here is just to be able to expand into being able to use the language in your daily life. That's why the main question here should always be, will this help me get conversationally fluent? And you want to ask that before adding a word to Anki. You want to ask that before obsessing over a grammar point, before watching a video, anything like that. Because that is the goal. And so if you're adding a word to Anki that you don't actually need to get conversationally fluent, kind of a waste of time. Same thing if you're obsessing over some very obscure grammar point. You can learn anything, but you can't learn everything. This is an important thing to keep in mind as well. People will try to learn absolutely everything, but it's just going to end up with you being really bad at a bunch of important things. Instead, focus on being good at the important things, and screw it if you don't know some like very complex vocabulary. Who cares? So to tie this all together, for the expand stage, you want a weekly routine, something similar to this, to be something similar to this. If it's 10 hours, you want roughly, let's say 60. I'm tired. 6 hours of input. A split, this is totally up to you. Could be like 4 hours of just some simple native input or like natural learner input. It sort of depends on how far along you are. Remember, in the beginning of the expand stage, you might be like 4 months in, let's say. And then towards the end of the expand stage, you could be like 20 months in. So obviously the kind of input that you're going to be consuming will be very different. Could just be only native input basically towards the end of it, and it could be like mostly learner input in the beginning, with some of that being reading. So you could just be watching like YouTube videos for 3 hours, 1 hour reading, and then 2 hours maybe of learner podcasts when you're on the go. And of course, if you exercise a lot, if you commute a lot, this could be a lot more than 2 hours, and I recommend it to be a lot more than 2 hours, because most people can honestly get in a lot more than 2 hours of podcast each week. This is one of the most powerful tools, and I'll probably make a whole separate video about this at some point. But one of the most powerful tools to get fluent in any language is leveraging podcasts and audiobooks and stuff like that. Basically, audio-only input that you can listen to wherever you are and whatever you're doing. Even if you're cooking or cleaning or whatever at home, you can do this. And so, you also want to add in some studying, right? Around 20% of your time, you want to spend around 20% of your time studying. Could be 1.5 hours of Anki, 30 minutes of grammar work, like with AI. So, for example, if you've looked up a rule, or let's say that you've spoken and recorded yourself, and you've noticed that, like, okay, you're not that good at using a certain grammar rule. In that case, you've written it down, and later in the day, maybe you chat with AI and you're like, hey, I'm not very good at conjugating a verb in this specific tense. Can you help me with that? And then it'll help you because it's very nice. And then around 2 hours of speaking each week. It's a very good idea. So, for example, you can maybe have a weekly recording of yourself speaking. That's like 30 minutes roughly. What am I saying? 30 minutes? 10 minutes. 50 minutes of self-talk, just kind of randomly across the week, like you're walking around and you're speaking to yourself in the shower, whatever. And then some like 60 minutes of writing with AI, or having a language exchange partner, or a tutoring session. This is mainly for that feedback and kind of real-time flow back and forth and speaking with a person. This is just a very practical, rather a very, just an example of a weekly routine that you can use. And it's weekly because you don't need to fit everything in every day. And also, don't worry if your routine shifts a little bit here and there. So long as it stays close to the split, that's totally fine. There's no like, I hate this shit, like, there's no one thing, like, oh, there's this one trick to learn a language. There's one, like, so long as you follow the principles roughly, you're good. Like, yeah, if you only do like some weird, obscure speaking drill every week, you might not get fluent. But if you have a rough mix of things, you're good. And it doesn't have to be as exact. Like, I'm telling you what I think is best here. But if you stray away a little bit from it, you're fine. So just know that if someone tries to tell you, like, this is the way, they're probably full of shit. And the philosophy of the expand stage is that it's not only about activities. It's about creating a lifestyle with a language, which includes finding shows you enjoy, finding your favorite YouTubers and artists, finding exchange partners and friends in the language, and also building routines and habits. This stage is going to be very much longer than the build stage, and you're going to move on when you can understand pretty much most of what you can hear. Not all, and not like 100% of a video, but like most of it. And you can also have conversations, but you still mess up quite a lot. So you should feel like you speak the language, and like you can survive, conversing with people and understanding a lot of stuff. You might have to ask questions like, hey, I didn't get what you meant there, or maybe you have to say something in a more simplified way, but you can still do it. So you still have some weak spots. For the goal of B2 Japanese, that's going to take like more than 2,000 hours, you might spend like 1,500 of it here. So it's going to be a while, okay? And that means that it could also take you somewhere around, it could take you like 3 months if it's a very basic goal, but it could also take you up to like 2 years. So be aware of that. And yes, just however long it takes for you, doesn't matter. But you should have accomplished these 3 things essentially whenever you do decide to make the move. And you make the move into the perfect stage. P stands for perfect in the BEP method, and the goal here is to perfect your skills. To go from just being okay to great at the language. And because of that, the exact time split is going to be pretty hard to determine, and I can't just give you a time split. Who's this stage even for though? Because unlike other stages, perfect is not going to be for everyone. And so if your goal is intermediate or lower, you're basically going to be done here. By following build at first to set yourself up for success, and then going on to expand your knowledge, expand and deepen your knowledge and also activate it through some output, you're pretty much set and you're going to be conversational. But if you want to go to the advanced levels and you want to reach a more of a native-like fluency, here's where that happens. We're going to move past the intermediate plateau that so many people talk about, and we're going to become truly fluent. You can still call yourself fluent in the previous stage, and you honestly are, but here's where we become more so masters of the language. First of all, we have to ask ourselves the question, why do so many people get stuck at the intermediate stage? The causes of the intermediate plateau can be found by kind of imagining yourself wanting to become a pro athlete. So in that journey, you're first going to start playing the sport. Everything's going to be new. You're going to be making crazy improvement, right? But after a while, you've got the routine down, you're dedicated, it's fun, and you're still progressing, but just slower. So it's still fun, it's still great, but it's slower. And a year or 2 later, or 3 or 4 or 5, what's going to happen? Well, the progress is going to be a lot slower. A lot slower. You've already learned all the basics, and you've already made those huge leaps. Like the first time you touch a basketball and you shoot it into the hoop, that's like the main concept of the sport. And so going from having no clue about the rules to knowing the rules, that's going to feel like a huge leap, right? The first time you like dribble a football or whatever, it's going to be a huge thing. But after a while, when you're learning this one tactic, it's maybe hard to notice your progress. And so you're good, but you're not quite where you want to be. That's when we ask the question of, why are we not there? And the answer to that is wrong expectations and bad prioritization. Learning a language takes time, especially to get to a high level. Me going from speaking English to my current level took multiple years of improving, but not at a crazy speed. So there were many years, like from 20, I probably quote unquote got fluent in English, like to where I could hold a conversation, I can understand people, etc. around 2016. And, was my progress very apparent between 2016 and 2017? No, not really. 2017, 2018? Not really. But when I look back, the progress was very obvious. I was getting better. I just didn't really notice it in the moment. And so the goal here with a perfect stage, and the reason that many people don't really get past the intermediate stage, is because they're not patient and they don't really find joy in the process itself. And on top of that, they're not ruthless with how they prioritize. That is the core of this stage. And we do that with 3 small changes to our routine. First of all, we introduce advanced input. Before here, we started with beginner content and then we went on to easier native content, right? But now we only watch native content. We only watch harder topics, or at least mostly, and we also sometimes turn off the subtitles to get us used to just hearing sounds, which is more difficult, and we maybe learn less like words in the moment, but we can really hone in on weaknesses doing it this way. We also look out for things like idioms, slang, nuance, accents. So we specifically take the input and we don't just try to understand stuff as good as we can. No, we already understand it. So instead we try to perfect individual parts of our language using input. And we also maybe pick a language parent. A language parent is basically someone that you listen to regularly and you choose because they're pretty similar to you. Maybe the same gender, maybe they are roughly the same age, they have similar interests, they have a similar kind of personality style to you, and it's someone who you would want to sound similar to. So I would pick someone who's like around 20 years old, has kind of similar hobbies, is just kind of a similar person to me, basically. And I would watch that person a lot, and I would also maybe shadow and kind of repeat what they say and try to mimic their accent, etc., etc. That is a way to kind of find out more specifically, how do people like me sound in the language? Because not everyone is just using the basic kind of forms of things. Maybe some people are using certain adjectives more. Maybe some people are using certain slang more, etc., etc. And that way you can kind of also choose an accent and kind of improve on that accent to sound more natural, pretty much. You want to keep going with regular input, but you just want to kind of incorporate some of this to work on weak topics, accents, etc. So don't totally quit what you have been doing up until this point, but just incorporate more of this. And also start incorporating some advanced output. This means 2 things: doing more output and doing forced output. Forced output includes speaking about complex topics, using new vocabulary intentionally, and trying new ways of saying things, like maybe using more formal things, etc. Forced output is a very big thing here. It could probably be the most important thing here. A big reason why you stay intermediate is because you only really know one way to say things. If you in school, for example, or if you're in like a course, you learn very basic adjectives, well, then you know basic adjectives to describe stuff, but a native speaker might just say it in a totally different way. So by using advanced input and kind of noticing those things and the differences between you and native speakers, and then using advanced output to when you speak and when you write stuff, you intentionally try to say things that you aren't comfortable saying. Like, in your head, you might think that a response to a question is one way, but you intentionally is like, okay, I'm not going to say it that way, I'm going to use a different word instead. Doing it that way makes it so that you then get used to saying a wider array of kind of like, let's say, adjectives, or you're using a more complicated verb instead of just like, to start doing something, or it's like something started, you say it commenced or whatever, right? These are not things that you're gonna have to use, but they could be useful. And if you want to be really precise in the way that you explain things, and you want to explain it in the way that a native would, you're gonna have to look out for these things. I saw some reel the other day about Spanish. It was like la salsa versus like la mayonesa, la mostaza, etc. Like basically, instead of saying the sauce, you specify what kind of sauce it is. It kind of encompasses this, honestly. A lot of people just use the simplest possible explanation, like, I want the sauce over there, give me the sauce. Like, okay, but a native speaker might say more specifically, like, give me the ranch or whatever, right? And so, if you don't pay attention to that, and when you speak, you're like, oh yeah, I had a steak with some sauce. Yeah, what kind of sauce? Like, actually make yourself uncomfortable and be like, okay, like I gotta find a specific word here. If you don't know that word, maybe you're speaking with someone, and you're gonna have to like try and explain it. Like, okay, it's this red sauce with this consistency, blah blah. Just forcing yourself to do stuff that's a little bit more uncomfortable here is how you truly go beyond being in that kind of comfortable and like okay level to being really good at a language, okay? And it's not all about sauces, but like you get the gist. So sometimes work on accuracy and pushing yourself, saying the most accurate thing possible, saying the most kind of native and natural thing possible, and other times just try to express yourself quickly and fluently. You want a mix of these at this stage, and that's what advanced output is. It's like you're not just speaking, because now you're comfortable speaking, now you're comfortable speaking quickly, etc., and you can make yourself understood. Now it's time to really get good at outputting. Have a mix of these. And also do something called weakness hunting. And this is the term that I came up with. Advanced output is actually a legit thing, like it's been researched and all that, but weakness hunting is my own thing. From your input and output, you're gonna notice where you're worse. You're gonna notice if you kind of struggle understanding a certain topic. You're gonna notice if you struggle understanding a certain accent. If you have watched a piece of content and there's a bunch of words that you don't understand, whatever, write them down, recognize those things, like I am worse at these things, and fix it. So examples of how to do that would be having conversations on, for example, italki with a tutor, where you're telling that person like, hey, I struggle talking about this topic. Let's really try and improve that. And whenever I explain something in a way that is a little bit less natural, correct me and give me other examples. It could also be having like a going onto ChatGPT and being like, hey, I struggle with this grammar rule or this certain conjugation, let's say. In Spanish, for example, a lot of people struggle with the subjunctive. So in that case, you can be like, hey, give me sentences to create in Spanish where I have to use the subjunctive term or like mix them, right? So give me a bunch of sentences in Spanish and I'm going to have to try to guess when I'm supposed to use the subjunctive versus when I can use kind of a regular form or whatever, or some other form. And when you make a mistake, it's going to correct you, and you're specifically just doing output, you're doing input, and you're getting stuff explained to you, but focusing on your weaknesses instead of generally doing it, right? And this is very useful because although you might have spent some time learning these things in the beginning, you don't really know how much time to spend on each thing unless you know how good or how bad you are at it. Like, you might read an explanation of a grammar rule, you might be like, all right, I got it, but then find that a year later, you still suck at it. So then it's going to need more targeted practice. And you also want to do the same thing with input, right? You want to watch more content on weak topics. You want to make more Anki cards with those kind of vocabulary. And you can also give whole transcripts to AI and work on them with them, right? So if you suck at understanding, let's say you want to learn more about like philosophy or whatever. You're interested in philosophy and you're bad at it right now. Well, then that's a weakness, right? You understand the language generally, but you don't really understand philosophy content. And so you might give a transcript of a philosophy video to AI and be like, hey, can you give me some questions about this video? And, help me understand the words, blah, blah, blah. And if your accent is weak, you can work on that. Basically, you just do your regular routine, sort of similar to your expand routine. But when you notice a weakness, you work on it for a while, and then you go back, and then you repeat. So you do regular routine, you notice a weakness, you work on it for a while. When it's fine, go back to your routine, and then you do that kind of cycle again whenever you notice something new. Because there's always something to improve, so you're basically never done in this stage. A summary of this stage is that I can't give you an exact routine. That's kind of a habit, or it's kind of a pattern by now, right? Because it's just too personal. Especially in this stage. Like, not everyone's gonna have the same weaknesses, etc., etc. Some people are actually like genetically gonna be worse at like grammar. Some people are gonna be worse at accents and better at other things, right? So it's gonna depend on you. But the general idea is that you want to stick to a base of good activities, similar to expand, and just tweak it to periodically based on your current goals and weaknesses. Some people will naturally have worse accents and grammar. I just said this. So just think what needs some work and use kind of a leveled up, more extreme version of whatever activity fixes it. If you're bad at understanding let's say an accent, just use input, but specifically watch input on that accent, right? Just use a more extreme method of fixing it. And for maximum progress, okay? Using these 3 tools in your routine more intensively makes sense. But when you also truly feel satisfied, you can cool it down a little and just focus on enjoyment, because by this point, you've earned it. there might be, let's say you're two years in, let's say. And then, between year 2 and year 3, you've kind of fixed a bunch of your weaknesses and whatever. At that point, it's like, okay, do you really want to be like heavily focusing on improving a bunch of things? Maybe you don't. Maybe you just want to enjoy the language, and that's fine too. And then you can come back to these whenever you feel like, okay, I'm not 100% satisfied with where I'm at right now. I feel like I have a few weaknesses. Then you come back to these, but you shouldn't necessarily see the stage as like one static stage. Like, okay, 3 months here, 10 months here, then like 5 months here. It's not really like that. These are more tools and a stage that you can periodically enter into whenever you notice that you're worse at a few things. And that's the BP method. We've now covered all the stages, from the build stage in your first months of learning a language where you're setting yourself up for success, to the expand stage where you're expanding further and going from just basic knowledge to now getting fluent in a language and getting more conversational, to the perfecting stage where you hone in on your weaknesses, you really target them, and you make sure that you have no weak spots left, at least not as many, and you become really dang good at a language. But there's one last, arguably most important piece missing that a lot of people skip. And if you skip it, I'm not going to say none of what I said matters, but honestly, none of what I said even matters. And that's implementation. How do you actually make sure that you're going to do all of the things that I've taught you up until this point? And that we've talked about, because these are all good tactics. You might have found a lot of things you're like, okay, I'm going to do that. I have a plan now, blah, blah, blah. But you got to stick to it. Implementation. No execution, no results. The real bottleneck isn't always your methods, so long as they're okay, right? It's often going to be learning consistently for long enough with enough focus. That's what a lot of people lack. So if you're serious about getting results, let's make sure you keep your motivation high, let's make sure you enjoy your language learning, and let's make the most out of your time. 4.1. Find motivation that lasts. That's important. So motivation, it is often just an afterthought. And I really hate advice like, just do it, or just be disciplined, bro. Because sometimes you gotta push through. That's correct, they have a point. But you wouldn't do anything without a reason to do it. I'm not gonna get too philosophical on you right now, but just understand this, like on a very basic level. Even if, like, the whole thing about being disciplined, it assumes that you still want to do the discipline thing more than the other thing. If you don't want to do the discipline thing more than the other thing, you're not going to do it. You're just not going to do it. So the whole thing of like, yeah, well, I work whenever I don't want to work. It's like, no, you still want to work because you want the long-term goal more than you like want the immediate pleasure of doing something else, right? So it's kind of a silly thing. No matter what, you need strong motivation. It's just not debatable. So to get fluent, we need consistency. And for that, we need motivation. And I've learned a few things that make that way easier. That I found that when I do these things, I stay way more consistent, I have way more fun, and I learn way more. And the first thing is understanding the 3 types of goals. So most people will say, I want to learn Japanese. And then they wonder why they lose motivation in 2 weeks. That's bad because the goal has no direction. It just says learn Japanese. To what level? Like, what do you want to do with it? There's no actionability, like you don't know what to do next week. And it's also not motivating enough because it's just like, learn Japanese. Okay, cool, but like, what do you want to do with it? Like, what is your ultimate vision? So you need a mix of 3 goals. You need North Star goals, which is your long-term vision. You need medium-term goals, which is like the next 3 to 24 months. And then you need short-term goals, which is the next month-ish. Few weeks, few days, whatever. Your North Star goals is your final vision. Usually you have like 1, but you can have multiple too. This is like the half bullshit vision that companies have to motivate their employees or to just sound good, right? Like, we want to be the go-to brand for sustainable customer experience excellence. It's like, I have no clue what that means practically. It's like the consultant talk, right? Consultants say like, oh, I wanna implement scalable, actionable solutions to solve customer problems. Like, okay, you're just saying a bunch of fluff. But what it does do is that it points us in the right direction and it gives us a reason. It's like, I want to be the best brand at this thing. Even however fluffy it is, however non-actionable it is, it does give us a reason to keep going. And so some examples of this is like moving to the country, speaking with friends, being 100% comfortable. This is something that, yeah, you don't exactly know what it means. Like, okay, You want to speak with friends, you want to be 100% comfortable, like what exactly is that level? Like you don't really know what it means next week, but it's still something that's very motivating to you, that's very like long-term and big, right? Same thing, feeling connected to the culture, connected with family, etc. The key is that you want to keep it ambitious and motivating for you. The guy who's starting a business just to make the bare minimum, or the guy who's making it to make $1 billion or change the world, who's going to be more motivated to work on a cold, rainy day? Probably the guy who has a bigger, ambitious goal, right? So that's the first goal that you need to have. But just a vision is not going to be practical enough. So you need medium-term goals. This is roughly on the time scale of 3 to 24 months, roughly. And my example is that I wanted to speak Japanese for a trip that I had coming up in 1.5 years. The good of this goal is that it had a time frame, and I had a strong goal, right? But the bad is that the goal wasn't specific enough. Like, speak Japanese. What level do I need? How much do I need to study to get there? I don't really know that, right? Speak Japanese? Okay, cool. But like, that could be B1, that could be B2, C1, C2, A2. I don't know. And so the result is that I got somewhere, but I had a lot of times where I slacked off with my studying. I didn't know exactly what to do. And as a result of that, my final level wasn't as high as I wanted it to be. So your goal should take some of the good things about mine and also some of the bad things about it and be specific. It should be specific, so you should have a clear level and ability that you want to get to. It should be time bound, so by X date, ideally, or roughly X date. And it should be intrinsically motivated, like you want it. This is your idea. This is something that you really want to accomplish just for the sake of accomplishing it. It could be that you want to reach B1 in 3 months to have conversations when you travel. If you love traveling, if you really could see yourself having those conversations, that's a great goal. And then maybe your long-term vision is like you want to be 100% fluent in the language because you want to travel and you want to, I don't know, move to the country, let's say. But this could be like a solid medium-term goal, or in 6 months, or in a year. And so if you have a North Star goal and if you have a medium-term goal, you're going to have some long-term motivation. That's all set, okay? But it's not really practical enough because you don't know what you're going to do tomorrow, right? Like, okay, you want to speak the language in 3 months and you want to be 100% fluent in the future. Cool, but what do I do tomorrow? I don't know. So you need short-term goals. This is on the time scale of weeks or months, could even be days, honestly. So you got to look at your constraints and just set a reasonable target. Like, for example, if you haven't spoke much yet, then maybe a good short-term goal to get you closer, because we also look at our constraints, right? What is the most important thing we could do? Well, if you haven't spoke a lot yet, you're probably bad at speaking comparatively to like listening or to doing other stuff. And so a goal that will put you in the right direction is to have a 5 to 10 minute convo in the language a month from now or 2 weeks from now or whatever. It could be to go from complete beginner videos to beginner videos in 2 weeks. Or if you have a hard time being consistent with listening, it could be like a quantity based goal of listening to 5 hours of podcasts every week, or just studying for 30 minutes every day. Combining these kinds of 3 goals will get you inspired, focused, and taking action toward what matters. So your homework is to write down one of each. But there's another hack that will make you more addicted to language learning than a crackhead is to his crack pipe. And that is identity. It sounds kind of weird, right? But one of the funniest things that I've heard a language learner do is eat cake with chopsticks. Why the hell did he do that, you might ask? Well, not to get too woo-woo here, but I've found that the people who get the best results and stay consistent for the longest are always obsessed with the language they're learning. It's like the dude in the beginning who's learning Japanese to impress his anime waifu pillow that he has on his bed. Like, if he really loves that anime waifu pillow, he's going to be damn motivated, you know? He's going to have the identity of like, I am Japanese already because I have a Japanese waifu pillow. And that's like a part of his life, you know? It's not just like he wants to learn a language because of whatever kind of reason, like, oh, it's kind of fun. No, like he has a big goal for it. Same thing for the guys who are like just obsessed with whatever. Like if you're obsessed with K-pop, well, you're really going to want to learn Korean, right? So you can't necessarily force yourself to become obsessed with something, but you can do a few things to help that. The key thing here, though, is that these people are not just learning the language. They damn near live and act like natives already. Their phone's in Japanese, their food's in Japanese, the music's Japanese, all of that, right? So the first step to this is that you're gonna act like a native. You don't have to go all out and become a total weeb, let's say. If you're not, if you are, great, that's awesome and it's gonna work in your favor. But find favorite artists, find favorite YouTubers, find favorite foods. Learn about the culture in general. Just get closer to that language. If you, this is funny, but if you stub your toe, honestly, like swearing in the language, that could help you. Because that shit honestly works weirdly well. And I put the weirdly here because it sounds like stuff that's not going to work. Like, oh, a tactic is to swear in the language when you stub your toe. Yeah, I mean, just building those instincts is going to make you feel more part of the culture that you're learning, right? And that's huge. And combining this with good goals means that you're going to stay consistent 24/7 because you have a really strong reason to do it, which means that you can't really quit. It's literally your life now. Now it's time to build consistency. You have the motivation, you have the reason to keep going. I can't stop learning Spanish. I mean, Spanish is a part of my life now. It's literally like just one of the things I do. I have a bunch of favorite YouTubers in Spanish. I'm not just going to stop watching them, right? My girlfriend speaks Spanish. I'm not just going to stop talking to her. So it's like, now you have that set. But it's time to integrate language learning into your daily life. And we do that in a few different ways. First of all, we build habits. You can get a shit ton of extra learning by just looking for gaps/dead time where you could be learning. Like, if you're on a commute or you're working out, listen to the language. If you're watching Netflix at night regularly, well, make it into your target language. If you're, let's say, eating, you can watch something in your target language then. If you are sitting down at the computer, well, try to make it a habit to do Anki first. Maybe regularly you go on to like Reddit or some random site or whatever. Well, now just make it like, okay, I'm going to sit down and instead of doing some random stuff, I'm just going to do 15 minutes of Anki. Then you already got 15 minutes extra there. And if you also worked out for an hour earlier, then you got an hour and 15 minutes extra, right? These all add up and they're super powerful. They really are. So this might sound basic, but it helped me so much. And if you aren't doing it, you're missing out. You're really missing out, okay? So start small when you're building habits. You don't need to try to study for hours a day when you're starting out because you'll just burn out, okay? Instead, slowly integrate these habits into your daily life and also replace pre-existing habits with language learning and slowly increase them over time. It's totally fine to start small. But you can still easily get distracted though. You have habits, you have a reason, and you built it into your daily life. But if you allow anything into your life, well, there's a bunch of things that are going to look a whole lot more appetizing that are going to steal your time. So we still need something else, and we need good environmental design. This is how we decrease the risk of external factors distracting us. Default habits is what I call this. This is the stuff you do without even thinking. And when you do something without even thinking, you're barely going to have time to choose something else. Brushing your teeth, for example, that is a habit, okay? But I wouldn't classify it as a default habit because you still decide when to do it. You wake up, you could brush it right away, right? Or you could have breakfast right away. Or you could like take a shower, then brush it. Or some people brush it in the shower. Some people like, there's a bunch of different alternatives, but it's not something that you just do right away. Although it is a habit, right? But pulling out your phone and scrolling the weather app in awkward situations, when you walk into an elevator, for example, that is a default habit because you walk in, you pull out your phone, and your finger just goes to a certain app, right? You don't choose that. And so we want language learning to become our default when we normally would do other things. So if we normally were to sit down, let's say, at our computer and open YouTube, well, let's make that YouTube into language learning YouTube instead. We do that by logging out of everything. And always, for example, logging into Japanese or Spanish YouTube. That's what I've done. So I have separate accounts where when I open YouTube, like as a default, I just sit down, I'm like, oh, I don't know what to do, whatever. I open YouTube, it's automatically a bunch of Japanese videos, if that's what I'm learning currently, or a bunch of Spanish videos, if that's what I'm learning currently. And what that does is that my default habit now turns into language learning, right? I could log out and whatever, sure, but that requires brain power. I'm like, okay, I'm consciously gonna log out of this YouTube profile to watch something else. Cool, I could do that. But if my reason aligns with language learning, like if I have a strong reason to continue learning languages, then I'm probably not going to do that. It's mostly going to be these kind of mindless distractions that take away your focus. And also, I even plan out like which podcast episode am I going to listen to when I go to the gym. Like I choose it beforehand, because if you go there and you're like, oh, I don't really know, whatever, you're just going to put on some music, you're just going to do something else, right? Plan these things out in advance and you'll learn way more. But to stay on track and avoid common traps, you're also going to need the right mindset. And that's 4.3. The reality check and staying on track. The 2 lies. The first lie, or myth, is the talent/age myth. It goes something like this. You can't learn without talent or without being a child. And this holds a lot of people back from starting. It has some truth to it though, but not really. So talent does exist when it comes to learning languages. It does, 100%. Some people are just going to be better at distinguishing different sounds. Some people are going to be better at pattern recognition, like just learning a grammar rule in 3 tries instead of 7 tries or 5 tries. And some people are going to have a better memory, so they learn a word quicker. These vary from person to person, and they make up your so-called language aptitude. But this only impacts you around, rough number, 40 to 70%. Which means that you might learn something in 1,000 hours, and someone else might learn it in, say 700 hours or 1,300 hours or 1,500 hours. But who really cares? Like, you can both still learn it. That's the important thing. And for age, yes, children tend to have a higher final level, like accent, for example. It's pretty hard for a person who's 30 years old to learn a language, like let's say Spanish, and sound as native as a real like Spanish person who grew up hearing the language all the time. But that person can actually use smarter methods that the child who grew up hearing Spanish couldn't. So if you're a child, or if you are, if you're a native speaker of a language essentially, and you've heard it since you're 0 years old, you couldn't choose to use like Anki. You couldn't choose to use narrow input or like the exact perfect level of like output or targeting your weaknesses. Like, you didn't know any of that. So you wouldn't be learning as quickly as the adult, even though the final level would probably be a little bit higher. And then there's also the truth of like, an 80-year-old, for example, might not learn as fast as a 20-year-old just because the brain is a little bit degraded and whatnot at that point. But very few people are on the extremes. Like, very few people are gonna try to even get the perfect accent, and very few people are 80 years old trying to learn languages. And if you are, it's still possible. That's the important thing here. Who cares, I say here. If the average is 1,000 hours, maybe it takes you 1,400, 700, or 1,000. But the key thing is that anyone can still learn a language. And the easy myth is the opposite. So others will say like, yeah man, learning languages is easy. I speak 50. Just like, listen to me. I'm going to give you the tips and tricks and like the one secret, And sometimes there are legitimate tips and tricks, like what I've hopefully shared in this video, right? But a lot of this stuff is just like BS. It's just sensationalist online polyglot BS. There's no one trick to getting fluent, and you can't get there in a day, in a week, or even a couple of months. Usually, I say. Of course, if you're, Spanish learning Portuguese, maybe you can get there in a month or two. But usually, it's going to take you a good system. It's going to take you executing consistently on that system for months and years to get somewhere. People flexing their languages on the street are usually full of shit, especially if it's more than 10. Then you gotta really raise an eyebrow, okay? And here's a question to ask yourself if you see those things and you get impressed and whatnot. Which is fine. Some of these people are legit, by the way, but a lot of them aren't. Ask yourself, do you want to say hi and introduce yourself in a language? Like, hi, I'll give you $500 if I speak your language. And then they say something and you're like, I speak your language. And they're like, and then that's your clip. But then be lost if they say something else. Like, what if they continue and they ask you like, oh, how did you learn the language? And you have to explain something that's a little bit more difficult than like, I went to university there. Like, what if they say, or what if you want to say, I went to university there and now I'm studying on my own. I really love the language because blah, blah. Like, a lot of these people who are flexing languages, they get lost after like a couple sentences, okay? Because it's very easy to sound fluent if you just memorized a little bit or if you just learned a couple of very basic things. But after a while, like if you continue that conversation, you'd probably look like a complete idiot. So do you want to be that person in 50 languages and just be very, very shallow, have very, very, very basic conversations? Or do you actually want to be good at a handful of languages? Ask yourself that, because while it is possible to learn, let's say, 10 languages, even 20 languages, there are some people who speak that many, it's difficult. And it's going to take you probably years for each language, or at least like many months. So most people who speak a lot of languages, they don't actually speak that many languages. So just be aware of that. And it probably takes you at least 500 to 2,000 hours for your desired level. That means that it's not 10 years of pure struggle and pain. But it's also not just one all-nighter with a secret cheat code that you found on some random, course somewhere. That's why the mindset you need is essentialism. You gotta understand what truly matters, you gotta do a few things and do them well. Because you'll hear about the flashy app, you'll hear about the new little tool, you'll hear about the secret method. Don't fall for it. The any benefit mindset is doing things just because it has a benefit. But you would never split $1,000 into 1,000 different investments just because they all have some benefit. You invest into what has the highest benefit. So if you know a stock is going to give you a 10x return and something else is going to give you a 5x return, yes, on paper, a 5x return is good, but you wouldn't put your money into it if you can put it into something else that's more beneficial. And the cake analogy basically says like, if you have a cake in the oven, let's say you have momentum when you're studying, you wouldn't take it out every 10 seconds to make one tiny change or look like, is it done? You'd lose all the momentum and focus. So if you truly find a good tool, use it by all means. But most shiny things are just going to be distractions. And if you have some fundamentals going, if it's in the oven, if it's a decent cake, just let it bake and it's going to be better than like some half-baked, piece of weird cake that's like all melted and disgusting. So just let your method do its thing. Most things are going to work pretty fine. Like you don't need every little new cheat code there is. And a little recap and some final notes. Here's the truth. Language learning takes time. It's not easy, but it is possible. And it's, I'd say, basically guaranteed if you use the right methods for long enough. Once you make it a part of your life, it's not even going to feel like a grind. It'll just feel like living. And you now have everything you need to make that journey as fun and as efficient as possible. You know why people do or don't get fluent, how to use each main learning activity in the best way possible, how to combine them all into one solid plan that works for you and your goals, and how to actually execute on it and enjoy the journey with the right mindset. All that's left is you actually doing it. So get out there and make it happen, because it's going to be something that's incredibly rewarding. And feel free to come back to this guide whenever you want a reminder or an answer to any question. I designed it as a big, very comprehensive resource where you can go back and get explanations on any topic or any kind of question that you may have regarding language learning. Thank you for watching. That's it for today. I'll see you guys soon, and until next time, keep learning.